All right, so the first thing I wanted to cover was just kind of step back a little bit and look at how far we've come through this process and refresh everyone's minds for those on the working group as well as out there in the public, what this process was originally designed to look like and how it's been going so far and where we're at in that process. So when the Rocky Shores project was initiated, it was broken out into a series of phases. The first one was a broad public scoping effort to try and understand what communities throughout Oregon, particularly on the coast, were concerned with as far as Rocky Shore habitats and resources, and how we might be able to use that information to shape the revision of the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy. And a result of that public scoping process was this public proposal process, which we are running right now. So that came out of those public scoping efforts that really was communicated to the working group that the public was really looking to play a larger role in the decisions about site-specific management at these Rocky Shore sites. Phase one of the process was the bulk of the text revisions to the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy. Those revisions were brought to OPAC and approved, but we understood that that was a draft and that final revisions were yet to come. So that's a little bit of our discussion later today. Phase two was development. We're largely focused on development of that public proposal process, which we're running now. And that public proposal process itself was divided into two processes, the initial proposal process and what we're calling right now the maintenance proposal process. And that initial process was to give us an opportunity to do what we're doing now, which is to pilot that process, evaluate how well it works, and come back at the end to revise the process so that we have a more robust process in the end that can withstand the test of time until we update the strategy once more. And then phase three is the phase that we're in now. So that's ongoing as we continue to evaluate these proposals and prepare recommendations for OPAC. So phase three will conclude with the end of the Rocky Shores Project of Special Merit on September 30th of this year. So everything that we prepared to do for this project will need to conclude at that time. All right, so in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, among other reasons, we've had to adjust this pilot process along the way a bit. I think everyone understands the reasons for why some of the decisions were made to adjust this timeline, and the public, we heard a strong call from the public to alter the timeline for this process, which we were happy to do. So that ended up compressing our timeline here for evaluations of proposals in early 2021. And this is where it ended up. And I know this is a graphic I've shown a few times, and every time I show it, I've had to update it. So essentially, proposals came in with the new year, and we got to work right away processing those, getting them out to our working group members, getting them out to our partners at tribal nations for their review. And throughout January, the state and federal agencies participating in the working group conducted the agency analysis. This is where agencies evaluate proposals for their completeness, as well as their feasibility for implementation as it aligns with agency jurisdiction and authority. Then the proposals were forwarded to the working group for their evaluations, where they worked through and conducted merit-based evaluations. So at the end of February, the working group convened a meeting where we voted on our initial recommendations that we would make to OPAC. And so these initial recommendations, the intent behind the process was to submit these for public comment. And at the end of that public comment period, to evaluate the feedback that we received from the public prior to making our final decisions. So that public comment ran March 15th to April 15th, and we forwarded all that information to the working group as quickly as possible. So here we are today to finish up other process items and talk about our preparations for making the final recommendations to go on to OPAC. So OPAC will be meeting May 17th. So that's when they will have their opportunity to make their recommendations. And just to look at the process a little bit, I talked about the initial process, the maintenance process, and these steps of recommendations. And just to refresh everyone's memory, this is how those two processes play out. The public builds a proposal, it goes through that agency step I mentioned, then the working group step, and now we're at the step where we're preparing to recommend to OPAC. OPAC will make their recommendations to the Land Conservation and Development Commission, who will then vote on potentially adopting some of those sites. And you can see here at the bottom another graphic I've shown you several times. This was our timeline for the remainder of the project that we devised last summer when we extended the proposal period. So that went from June to December. And here we are in 2021, the January through April. We're very close to the end of our evaluation timeframe here. And again, project completion will be in September. And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about kind of how the next steps are going to play out in this process. And the approval process, so that's this is essentially a different version of those arrows I just showed you. But initially the agencies review, the working group, and if necessary, OPAC will send anything back to the working group for revision. And at the end of that chain, proposals that make it through the various rounds of approval will then be implemented into rule. All right, any questions from our panelists about the processes here? All right, then I will jump into our overview of the 30-day public comment period. So I did send out a meeting process document, which outlines some of this information, but we'll go over it here for the benefit of everyone listening.
Moses, quick question. Yeah. Were you able to make that update on the public comment breakdown?
I'll touch on that here in just a moment.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So in total, we received 112 independent comments received. So what Charlie was referencing was that one of the comments we received was actually a packet of comments associated with a petition filed by the Audubon Society of Lincoln City. So unfortunately, those weren't reflected in the meeting process document that I sent out as independent comments. So we'll try and update some of that analysis that we've provided on comments to reflect those as independent comments. So you can see here kind of my superlative overview on the slide. Aside from that petition, we received 112 independent comments from 124 individuals representing 21 organizations. If you include the ASLC petition, that had 233 signatories and 168 comments affiliated with those signatures, all in support of the Cape Lookout and Cape Foul Weather Marine Conservation Area proposals. Of the rest of the comments, though, we had quite a number of remarks on specific proposals, 30 remarks on the process itself, and we had 11 comments that we could identify that expressed clear opposition to one or more proposals or the process itself. So you can see the breakdown here on the table and in this pie chart. And again, this represents all the independent comments aside from the comments submitted with that Audubon petition. And you can see a fairly even distribution for most of the sites. There were 3 or 4 sites that didn't receive a whole lot of comment that we could identify, but the rest of them fairly comparable level of interest. All right, we also, the analysis looked at where some of these comments were coming from, in case that anyone finds that information relevant for them. And we received a large number of comments that we could identify the location on from folks who are residents of the Oregon coast. About a third nearly were unknown though, so that could change this outlook a lot. But of those that were identified themselves as coming from the Oregon coast, you can see the breakdown on the right there that we had about half of the comments on the coast were folks coming who were living on the north coast. And if you dig through those comments, it seems to be a lot of the folks were commenting on proposals that were kind of in their area, in their own backyards, so to speak. And the organizations that were represented, there was quite a number of folks who identified themselves as affiliated with a particular organization. So I've provided that information for your review here. You can see Audubon and their chapters and affiliates had about 41 different comments there. And a number of other organizations either submitted comments or had members of those organizations submit comments in affiliation with them. As far as the comments in opposition that we were able to identify, there were 11 individuals who submitted comments in opposition, but there were 22 mentions of specific proposals in those comments. So for example, someone might have submitted a comment and then say, I don't support site X for these reasons, and I also don't support site Y for other reasons. So that to help you understand that breakdown here. All right. Before I move on to the next point, were there any questions from our panelists about the comments? Okay, Walter.
Yeah, Walter, go ahead.
Yeah, Moses, did you break these comments down? How many were alike? And what I mean, were they just cut and pasted and then signed? How many of these were actual original comments?
I don't have specific numbers on that, but that was in part one reason why I provided, the breakdown of organizations here, because that kind of helps us get a sense of some of those that are copy pasted or that borrowed items from other documents or emails. So there was.
That doesn't do much for me, Moses. I'd like to see an actual breakdown of original comments versus cut and paste. And on the petition, the same would go for that.
Okay.
So an actual number, not just attributed.
Moses, if you want to, we can look at how we summarized the public scoping process. We did something similar where we got a very large volume, potentially thousands, I think, of like kind of the same comment. And I remember Deanna did a sort of bundling exercise that helped us kind of fraction that out. So we could have that ready for the next meeting or for OPAC. It wouldn't be that hard, I don't think.
No, that wouldn't be that hard. There's definitely a lot of copying and pasting, but there's other times where things are kind of piecemealed together where it looks as though they are using the same language or similar language, but it wasn't a straight copy and paste. But it seemed to be referencing specific items that were otherwise copied and pasted in many other emails.
That's important for me to know, Michael, because I would like to make sure that these are original comments versus cut and paste.
Great. Any other comments or questions from our working group? All right. Well, I'll look into doing that, and as well as tweaking some of these tables and figures to more accurately represent the comments that are in the petition and Walter's request.
I'd just like to say thanks for those who provided public comment. It was extensive. There was a lot of public comment on all different sort of sides of it. And I felt like some of it was really quality as well. So I'm not going to say that I liked it all or it made me feel good necessarily, but none of these things, public processes, are difficult. And but I really appreciated everybody taking the time to provide public comment. As somebody who often participates in public processes, I know that that's an endless task sometimes.
Scott has a question as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Just a comment. I just wanted to say I really appreciated the original comments that were made as well. It showed real thoughtfulness when people took the time to write an original comment. And I found that those comments most helpful.
Thank you, Scott. All right. Anyone else?
Just I would echo what Scott said for the members of the public who may be listening or providing public comment as we move forward on this. Very specific comments, site specific proposals comments or process comments are very helpful, and being constructive in those is really helpful for us. We do get a lot of more deconstructive comments. We know that we didn't do everything perfect. And it's easier to receive comments that help us find the right solutions and the right way forward, rather than looking at the wrong ways that we may have done something in the past. And I recognize that the challenging times called for some challenging measures for all of us on this. So I appreciate everybody's engagement.
Thank you, Charlie. All right. If there's no other comments or questions, I will move on to our next item, which is the draft strategy text.
Moses, I did just want to have you briefly address the public comments that came in about proposals themselves and misconceptions and corrections. Can you describe what we've done so that we made sure that we got that component right?
You might have to trigger my memory here.
Yeah, so we did get some comments that details in our draft initial recommendations were not correct about the proposals. And as such, we asked the proposers to help us understand those. And when they provided corrections on the record, we appended those corrections to the draft initial recommendation documents that were available publicly, in order to provide the best information regarding each proposal, so that public comment that came in on them could be reflected accurately to the proposal's intent.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That's right.
Hopefully, and Andy, hopefully we'll be able to have that dialogue Thursday a little bit more, as when the presenters are available to be kind of have the Q&A. I think that's probably the best time to dig into that, but I do think it's important to recognize and identify that where there were misconceptions or misinterpretations, that those have been addressed as best as possible in the record for the working group. I think honestly the best moving forward on that will be Thursday's exercise of the Q&A with the proposers themselves. So we're not constantly talking about this in the absence of those who intended to put that forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to recognize that we heard that comment loud and clear, and wanted to take action to make sure that all of the proposals were presented with the information that the proposers wanted. So as early as possible. Okay, I think enough said on that one. Moses, why don't you take us into the next item?
Thank you. All right, so excuse me. In the February, or excuse me, when the working group last met in February. Nope, sorry, I'm on the wrong note here. Need to skip around. All right, so OPAC last approved a draft of the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy last May in 2020 at their meeting then. So since then, the working group has reviewed and approved changes to the text, mainly in their November and December meetings. These were not big changes to the text itself, but they did include a few items such as clarifications on the proposal review and evaluation process. We also included some modifications to the text, which came out of our efforts to coordinate with coastal tribal nations for better inclusion and representation in the strategy text for them. And we briefed OPAC on these changes in their December 2020 meeting. So since December, DLCD and staff, DLCD staff have worked to prepare the document for its final approval this May. So this includes correcting any remaining issues with grammar, formatting, punctuation, or other Scrivener's errors for the most part. So no real substantive changes have been made to the strategy at this time. So most of the changes that the working group saw in their track changes draft were relatively minor. But I wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to get fresh eyes on it one last time and identify anything that may still be needing some alteration. So the working group clarified details of the approval process in their previous meetings, as I mentioned. And the intention for the initial process here was always to reevaluate and refine the process after we had run it, to understand what worked, what didn't work, what could work better, those kinds of things. So that this very much what we're in is a pilot run of this process, as I've mentioned. Because we have altered this timeline as we've been running it, as I mentioned at the beginning, in response to COVID and other issues going on, it's been necessary to kind of squish down our timeline on this end of the process, and that's tightly constrained each step of this process. So as a result, in order to appropriately address these revisions, they're going to require some ongoing engagement, not only potentially with some of the members of the working group, but also with our proposers and other members of the public to ensure that in the end we have a robust final process. So while the bulk of the strategy is ready for OPAC approval, DLCD staff at this time are recommending that the working group recommends OPAC delay revisions to the process sections of the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy. So that happens to be Section E and Appendix C. These are the sections of the draft text that outline the proposal processes as well as the proposal form questionnaire itself. We're recommending that the working group consider delaying revisions to these two sections. And a big part of that reason being that because of our constrained timeline right now, we don't have sufficient time to appropriately address process revisions that they otherwise, to give the process revisions the time they deserve. And because that's going to take some coordination with our proposers and the public at large in general, that's going to require a little bit of extra time. So we're recommending to delay this process. Charlie.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, that section E is what we're really talking about here. And as you read through the public comment, you'll see there's a lot of dissatisfaction with process. And right now, what we really need is clarity on the proposals that are in front of us, that where there's been a lot of time put in. So that was one of the reasons why this recommendation is coming to the working group. The other is that I think we do need some time to both hear from the public, but I'd also like to hear from OPAC. A lot of this process has been guided by a public process, and one of the things I've recognized in other types of area-based management work is that these proposals and the proposal process itself could really benefit from whether it's some executive leadership around it, or if it's OPAC leadership around it, some expectation. And some of our process right now is a varied expectation from both people that we're proposing and from those who are on the receiving and evaluating end. So I think some better leadership might come out of OPAC in May, or we may hear otherwise as well from our proposers in a workshop or so, how we can better address that. But I think what's most important for us right now is to focus on these proposals and take care of the elephant in the room, in my opinion, which is these proposals and all the work that's been put into those. I am open though for us to discuss this, and if there's concerns with that approach from the working group, I'd like to hear them. Or if you're supportive of this approach, I'd like to hear as well, I guess.
I think Moses has the next slide to help guide us through our thinking on that though. So let's let him move forward a step so that we can provide a little bit more context.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so revisions to the process really going to need to rely on additional feedback and a coordination between proposers as well as our state agency representatives. So this effort might be likely to include things like a survey of our proposers, one or more collaborative workshop meetings between proposers and agencies to refine process details. And these kinds of efforts are something that we could do following the OPAC meeting here on May 17th. So what we're recommending is that we forward the rest of the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy for OPAC approval, and then after the OPAC meeting, focus on that process revision effort. So we would review processes, coordinate with our proposal teams to rework what the maintenance proposal process is going to look like, and then bring that final revised process back to OPAC in their fall 2021 meeting. So I've created a conceptual diagram here on the right in yellow. So that kind of hopefully helps you understand what we're talking about here. So we have the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy. The bulk of it goes to OPAC for approval right now. But then the proposal process sections we pull out and workshop those over the summer and bring them to OPAC in the fall. So this may or may not involve the entire working group, but at the very least will involve our state agency representatives and the folks on the proposal side who've been engaged with this process. So are there thoughts from the working group on making this recommendation to OPAC?
Dave, and then Walter, and then Laurel.
Yeah, this is Dave. Sorry, we kind of went right past the text revisions, and I had a comment on those. Are we going to get to those, or?
You can, go ahead and comment on them.
Oh,
well,
okay.
Well, let's sort out agreement on the process, and then we can go back, Dave. If you have a specific comment in the text, we can address those. But I want since we've just given context on kind of dividing the two components of the strategy that we're hoping to move forward. Let's make that kind of conversation complete before we go back into the details.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I did have a comment on this process. I'm supportive of going this route to really refine, our proposal process and take the time to do that, so we do a good job at it and bring it to OPAC in fall. Thanks.
Great. Walter, you're next.
Yeah, thanks. I just need to point out that there are quite a few OPAC members up for replacement within the next 6 months. And that if the working group should come up with a proposal process recommendations also, otherwise we might be looking at another year or so for some of the current members past their expiration date. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration also.
Yeah, it's good to think about also changes happening at OPAC for sure, and how that impacts or relates to the work that we need to get done as a part of this. Laurel, and then Tom, Calvanese, and then Dick.
Yeah, I was just wondering, given, the lift at the next OPAC meeting with all the proposal decisions, if there was any thought, is there a reason why we're trying to separate out the text changes? Or if it would, has there been thought given to putting it all, the text changes into one package and not splitting it up? Or is there a reason for that, I guess is what I'm asking. I understand that there needs to be additional work on the
Capacity and time. Between now and mid-May, we don't have time to take in all of the public comment and all of the concerns around the process, workshop that through all of the working group members, the state agencies, everybody who participated on the evaluation.
Sure. Oh, I understand that. I'm just wondering why it doesn't all just go as one package later. Why are we splitting that piece out of the rest of the text edits?
Because we have 12 proposals in front of us right now with some expectation from the public about us evaluating that.
No, I get that. I'm just saying we focus on the proposals at the next OPAC meeting, and then the process and the rest of the edits to the actual document could happen as a package. My point being that we have a big lift with the proposals, but it seems like we're approving part of the text edits, but not the process piece. So I was just asking for if there was a reason for that. Well, I totally get the other piece of it. That's why I'm asking the other question.
Yeah, Laura, I think that our agency, selfishly, we have some deadlines associated with grants. Amendment of Part 3 of the Territorial Sea Plan is part of that, and so we wanted to be able to move that work forward to OPAC and LCDC so that we could, meet those deadlines. And as we talk about here in a minute, some sites may be ready to move forward to OPAC as a recommendation, and those early sites could be on a slightly different path than some of the other sites. And I believe that's why we kind of had two kind of packages of things going to OPAC and into the future. So there was selfishly some reasoning for wanting to have our TSP chapter amendments into LCDC and eventually to NOAA as well on the earlier timeline.
Okay, that's all I was wondering.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So Tom, and then Dick.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly that to me it makes sense to carve out this discussion and revision, hopefully, of the process and put that on a slower track, give us time to really resolve, whatever issues we find with it. The only question I have is if we're at the same time going to develop a set of recommendations to OPAC. It would be great if that isn't constrained by the revision to the proposal process. So I know that's a little bit of a fine point, but just want to kind of call that out so we don't sort of step on our process in that way. So if we're saying we're going to revise the process going forward, I guess what we call the maintenance process. Yeah, and I think you're saying that. Okay. So just that clarification probably, so that we have the opportunity to make recommendations to OPAC for this spring meeting. That doesn't, that revisions to the maintenance process doesn't get in the way of us making recommendations to them about sites or anything else at this stage.
That's the whole point of this.
Got it.
Or one of them, so that we can actually deal with the proposals in the room, and make sure that we have that clear recommendation for OPAC at this one, because I don't think we can take both on.
Copy.
Thank you, Dick.
Yeah, thanks. First, I just want to say I am in support of the proposed process, if you will, to evaluate the proposal process in depth over the summertime. And I just want to certainly put a fine point on it, and special support for not delaying the part 3, forwarding that to OPAC in May, just because we put a lot of time in on that over the years, and there's been a lot of good language in there. Whatever minor text revisions we are going to be looking at here in the next hour, I think are minor, and I just don't want to see us lose momentum on TSP and delay that any longer. So thanks. I think this is a good idea to again delay a little bit just the process dialogue, so we can get it right, or at least get it better. Thanks.
Thank you, Dick. Any other comments? And then I think we can go back to maybe Dave's question or comment about the specific language. And I see Carrie sent a chat that she agrees.
Sure. This is Dave. You want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, it's pretty minor. The table 1 regulatory standards and management practices, it appears on 2 places in the strategy. The first is on page 34. And I don't know, Moses, do you have that up in front of you? Or?
Yeah,
Yep, bear with us here as we pull that
Okay.
up. And maybe while we're waiting, Andrea, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I also have a comment on the table since Dave
Okay.
is bringing it up. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
So table 1, Dave.
Yeah, you got it. On the marine garden for the marine aquatic vegetation. So if you scroll down to marine aquatic, yeah, okay. Sorry, mine cuts off the bottom part of the screen. The language, the revised language says permit. Oh boy, I'm seeing the one on the screen is different than the one I have.
Well, I think, let me make sure I have the same.
Yeah.
I'm working off of my version that has more comments.
So the version that was sent out is definitely different than the one that you were just showing, Moses.
Yeah.
And it, at least in that marine garden column, it actually removes the DSL language and adds ODF and W language. And part of my comment would be to add the DSL language back, but to tweak it slightly to make it mirror the marine reserve or research area, sorry, not marine reserve, marine research area column.
And my comments to remove the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife language, because we don't have jurisdiction over aquatic vegetation, so there would be no permit from us in that situation.
Okay.
So in that, I think we've talked about this before, but I would really love to change the word permit to authorization because it's more inclusive, because we authorize things that under our proprietary program that aren't considered permits. So just so it's like clear that it's not specifically into our regulatory management. Sorry, I know that that's in the weeds, but it is a very clear distinction between our programs.
It does. That makes good sense. It could be an authorization as part of some other type of permit and not necessarily a permit for that particular thing.
And-
GSL has a lot of activities, so that makes sense to me.
And Laurel, do you have?
Other version I had up, which is my track changes draft.
It's okay, Moses, I can send you, because I have my copy up too. I hadn't sent it yet because I figured we would talk about it and maybe I would think of new things. But I will send you the draft language that I have in my copy.
Okay.
Thank you.
For the benefit of the working group and those watching, can we repeat the clear edit that needs to be occur here? And I think this is just about the right regulatory agency and the right language that makes DSL comfortable. But can we just be clear, just so that we're for the record making this recommendation?
Moses, do you want to spell that out or do you want me to say it? Because I believe it would say requires an authorization from the Department of State Lands or Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, and then includes the last thought associated with that sentence. Does that make sense to everyone? And Laurel, you still have a hand raised. And if you're talking, oh,
Sorry, yeah, I was having trouble getting it unmuted. I just was asking if that change with the language was consistent with the rest of the document, and I think it is. I did a word search, just the change from algae to marine aquatic vegetation. It looks like it was just, we didn't catch it in the table, but it already was the case in the rest of the document. So that was my question, but I think I answered my own question.
Yeah, you may remember the policy discussions we had about a year ago about changing that term and defining that term in the policy section and in the glossary. So I just wanted to make sure the rest of the document was consistently reflecting that change.
And Dave, your hand just popped back up.
Yeah, just Moses probably already knows this, but just a reminder that table occurs twice in the document.
Yeah.
So just to be sure the changes are consistent.
We'll make sure to get it in both places.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Andrea, hand up again.
Sorry, yes, I just, for consistency, the same changes to the marine research area column as well, because it uses the term permit as well. So just wanted to flag that. Thank you.
Okay. I will make those changes, but Andrea, send me your version as well. So to make sure that I have what I have is consistent with that.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there, oh, hold on. Yep. Okay. That was the chat from really good. Are we all in agreement with that change to the table, given what we just heard, the dialogue that we just heard? Maybe just a thumbs up or a chat of yes.
If you have any concerns.
Yeah, like speak now if you have any concerns.
No concerns with me.
Okay. All right,
I
Moses.
just have a quick, just a quick comment that the language that we're putting in there, excuse me, specifically says research, and the policy says appropriate recreational, scientific, restoration, and educational use. So if we use that term as an umbrella for all the uses that we say we permit or authorize, I think it's fine, as long as we understand that we're using this umbrella term and we're spelling out the possible uses in the policy. Just aiming at that question about consistency, just to make sure what the policy says and what the table says are
So
the same.
this edit is a result of that policy discussion, Tom,
Right.
that happened about a year ago. So that's where we talked about the definition of algae and the terminology that we were using, and this marine aquatic vegetation came out as the more consistent. But your intuition is correct.
Okay, so this is capturing in table form the policy that we all agreed to on, what was it, Q? Sounds good.
Yep.
It might also just be worth a word search on the word algae, Moses, just to see if there's anything that pops up that catches us off guard elsewhere in the text. I don't think there is, but.
Yeah, I think we can handle that one.
Yeah, we don't need to do
outside
it right
of discussion here.
Were there any other comments then on specific changes? Okay.
Why don't you go back into your slide deck, Moses, and
Okay. All right, so if there's no other discussion then on changes to the text, the primary focus here was trying to make sure that the working group all understood what the suggestion here was. And again, that suggestion is to delay revisions to Section E and Appendix C, workshop those over the summer in some manner, and bring those changes to OPAC in their fall meeting. Now, one other item that's contingent here is that originally we had set a start date for the maintenance process on October 1st of this year. But if we are going to be revising this process throughout the summer and up until the fall OPAC meeting, which is likely to be later than October 1st, there's a good chance that we will need to, either because of the timing or because of the revisions to the process itself, delay that start date of the maintenance proposal process. So that would be a decision that to have the working group make now, that we would put that off, and that the new start date would be determined through this revision process itself. So I'll throw those 2 points up on the screen here, and these were in the meeting process doc. So the first recommendation from DLCC staff is to delay those changes to the process itself and revise them this summer. And the second recommendation then, contingent on that, is to delay the start date of the maintenance process until a time determined by those process revisions.
yeah, and I think that there's one other reason why I would make a recommendation potentially in delaying the start, and that is that I believe that we should try and have a potentially 2-year time cycle that can be synced up with kind of agency budget proposals, so that as we are forwarding ideas to OPAC and getting OPAC recommendations on future site designations, the work to support that can be kind of tailored with requests, so that resources can be devoted to potentially new designations. And so if we wanted to have a date, a new date that we might recommend to OPAC, it would be fall of 2022. as a start. We could set that as a target if we wanted to, but I don't believe we have to at this time. But if that's something that OPAC was interested in, that would be a staff recommendation. Charlie, you have your hand, and then Walter.
Yeah, so I think that we've already made a decision point on number one. I'm not sure if we need to revisit that, but I will allow our process to dictate that, just for efficiency of time. But for the second point, I just wanted to remind folks why we put the start date of the maintenance process when we did, before we have this potentially long discussion. If you'll remember, back in say October of last year, we didn't know how many proposals we were going to get. We knew that we had a confined timeline for evaluation and that it was going to sync up with a lot of other conflicting things like the legislative session and otherwise. We put that maintenance process proposal date out there as a signal to the public to say, like, hey, we're kind of drowning in our process right now. And if we put this future date out there, understand maybe we'll have the process better figured out. We'll run this pilot stage. And it was really a signal to the public for when they could expect, a proposal process to ramp up again if they decided not to put their proposal forward. I don't know what, out of the number of individuals that were going to submit proposals, I don't know if they all submitted proposals or if any of them held out and were waiting and expecting October 1st. But I do know that we got a lot of proposals. We had 12 of them. And so I don't know that there is still that public interest, but I wanted to make sure that we potentially allow for some public comment around that, or at least here, given the reason we put that date out there was, again, to signal a future when it would start. And if folks don't feel like that's necessary, that's fine too. But I just wanted to remind folks of why we made that decision. It's helpful before we enter a discussion about what we want to recommend. That being said, I would support the recommendation.
Walter.
Yeah, I just want to state again for continuity's purpose and new members on OPAC, and that, we're looking at maybe another 6 to 9 months, maybe even a year of members on the working group. And we need to make sure that everyone on the working group is willing to put in that time. And that also we need to acknowledge that it would be great if the members on OPAC, if we do extend this timeline, they do stay there to finish this process out.
Yeah, that's a great clarification, Walter. And this is a staff recommendation to OPAC. And so I do believe that this is a decision point that OPAC needs to support as a whole.
Thanks, Andy. I just wanted to put it again out there just for continuity's sake and everything. I appreciate it.
Great. So I want to just take a moment here to make sure that we as a working group have consensus on a recommendation of the first bullet, that we will be forwarding the draft strategy to OPAC for approval at their May meeting, with the exception of Section E and Appendix C, which will be worked on over the summer. So maybe the best way to do this is because I believe that we do have pretty good agreement on this. So please let me know in a chat if you do not agree with that first bullet. And it's fine too if you want to put it in the affirmative so that you support the first bullet as well. Thank you, Scott. And go ahead, please, when you do chat, make sure that you chat to all panelists and attendees so that attendees can see the chat. Come on. Agreement from Sean and Dave Fox and Scott. Agreement from Dick and Carrie. From Andrea. Dave Lacey. Okay, I am not seeing any disagreement through the chat and a lot of agreement. So I want to now say that we as a group have reached consensus on that recommendation, and I'm now going to ask if we have consensus on the second bullet. Let's go through the same thing here.
Can I just ask a point of clarification?
Sure, Charlie.
Because this has to do with Walter's comment. I don't think that we're necessarily saying that it is the work of this working group to do that latter work as far as revising the maintenance proposal process based on a process that engages state agencies and the public. I don't know that we're making that decision, which I recognize would be sensitive because I don't want to drag members of this working group into a process that maybe is a year and a half past what they were expecting to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think as the working group was a participant in this process, you were a participant in the evaluation end. I think that your feedback is really important, just as important as that of the proposers. So, but I don't necessarily see that as a working group led process. Maybe more of an internal state agency or something that OPAC could inform.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification, Charlie. I have two hands raised, Dave and Dick. You guys have questions or comments?
Yes, this is Dave. Just a point of clarification. So we're recommending that maintenance proposal process be delayed, but we're not actually recommending a date, right? You gave fall of 2022 as a potential date, but that's not going to be set at this point, right? We're just recommending a delay.
That is correct.
Okay.
Dick.
Same point actually, but regarding the no date, but I would actually I think people would like to see a date, even though we may. I think the idea of putting it fall of 2022 is fine. I think just a date gives people, the public, some certainty. And even if we get through the process over the summer months and say, gee, it's going to take us longer and we have to delay that, I just think that some certainty of a date, understanding that it may have to be modified given how long things may take and unknowns. I think that's just we've been trying to give dates to the public in the past. I think that kind of is a nice thing to continue.
I tend to agree. And I would be open to amending the second bullet to add a date of October 1, 2022 as a place to start. I see agreement with having a date included. Charlie?
I can support this, and people are not going to like what I have to say, but I just want to share an observation that from coming through this process and others, the target date constrains time, which is a constraint on time, could be a constraint on capacity. So, for example, we constrained this process to a time frame, and what we got, what I believe, was more proposals than we had the capacity to evaluate for fully state agencies and the working group through the time period that we had. It was very constrained. So I think it's important to potentially inform other types of sideboards to meet that constraint if you were going to put a target date on there, because we don't know what could happen between now and that target date with respect to people's time, agencies' budgets, et cetera.
Yeah, I
And
agree with
yes,
that, Charlie, but I see Scott's comment.
and to Scott's point, exactly, yeah.
But I'm still comfortable putting a date because there's nothing like a deadline to sharpen the mind, as
Absolutely.
my former manager would say.
Yeah, I'm calling attention to the fact that if that date falls right before the legislative session after a poor agency budget year, that you recognize that you're going to be constrained on your ability to participate and meet the expectations of the public. But I totally support this. I'm just trying to highlight that there's a leadership moment to be had there, and it should be taken down the road.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Okay, so Dave, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is that important. Just one other comment on the date. If you're trying to time this with agency, kind of budget proposal process, it would have to be earlier, or it would have to be not fall of an even numbered year. It'd probably have to be fall of an odd numbered year, or at latest, kind of winter of an even numbered year. Just because by fall of an even numbered year, it's pretty, from the agency standpoint, the budget's already set in motion. There really isn't a lot we could do to change it as an agency. Of course, the legislature can, and governor's office can, but really the agencies can't. So if you wanted to time it with agencies, it would have to be at least 6 to 8 months earlier than that. But that wouldn't fit our current, at least, maybe this is off into the future when that date maybe gets changed to meet that timing a little better.
Yeah, Dave, I recognize that and understand that comment, and think that we as agencies should be planning to create proposals that can help to support our activities in support of Rocky Shore management, at our earliest convenience, I believe, given the public's interest in this process and in this issue more broadly. So point taken. But I think that setting a fall of 2022 date is still, I think, a good practice for us to try and hit as our next kind of timeline that new proposals could come in the door. So I did get a lot of agreement with the second bullet, with the idea of including a date. Moses, thank you. Charlie, and
I'd just like to offer that maybe, other than us arbitrarily decide on that date right now, that maybe we hear public comment and maybe we hear from OPAC before.
Sure.
We set that, and that.
I think having a tentative target is okay, and describing it in that fashion should give OPAC the message that they should feel that they have the ability to move that window. Because I agree with the potential needs and other points that may be raised by folks who are participating with us. But I am hearing general consensus with a delay. And if you could all let me know through the chat whether or not we have consensus on this bullet, that would be great. Okay, Moses, I think we have consensus on both of these points.
Okay.
And now I'm going to take a facilitator process opportunity and say that now is a good time to have a very quick break. I could use one myself. So let's give ourselves until 2:25. We will reconvene 2:25, but for now, on a little break. All right, are we all back, folks? So Laurel, maybe I can ask you and Moses to just work together to fine tune, make sure there's no algae references that are out of date in the strategy. All right, I think we can get going again. Thanks, everyone.
All right, so we're going to move on to the proposal recommendation process itself. So when the working group devised the public proposal process, like I mentioned earlier, was divided into two: the initial pilot process, which we're running right now, and then the ongoing open enrollment maintenance process, which would ostensibly go on until the next revision to the Rocky Habitat Management Strategy. So again, the intent behind this here was to reevaluate the process once it was over. So the working group is now tasked at the moment with making recommendations on both process and proposals. So we want to, now that we have figured out what we're going to do about the process, which is to delay revising it until we have made our proposal recommendations to OPAC. So now we need to turn our focus on proposals and how we're going to craft our final recommendations. So the working group is going to make their final recommendations on site proposals on this Thursday in our April 29th meeting. And the voting method that was used to facilitate our initial recommendations back in February will not be the same method used for final recommendations. The method that we're going to use to craft final recommendations will instead be based on the standard voting procedures that OPAC uses to make their decisions, which we'll go through right now. So the voting procedures that OPAC uses is to first debate and discuss, in our case, which will be the final recommendations and the conditions that we have outlined in those initial recommendations, and any modifications to those conditions, either as a result of the feedback we've received from the public or as a result of the working group's further evaluation during this time period. The first step in making the actual recommendation will be to work toward consensus. So we're going to take a sidestep here real quick then and talk about what consensus actually means in this context. So consensus means that each member of the voting body, in this instance the working group, can say that one, I was a respected member of the group that considered the decision. Two, my ideas, opinions, knowledge, concerns, beliefs, hopes were listened to by the group. Three, I listened to the ideas, opinions, knowledge, concerns, beliefs, hopes of others on the working group. And four, I can support the decision of the group, even though I might have made a different decision had I acted alone. So these four things together define consensus. So this is how OPAC defines their consensus. So we feel that the working group should strive to achieve a similar process here and establishing consensus first. So to do that, as we've already seen in this meeting, we can determine whether consensus has been achieved simply by asking if there's anyone who feels that it has not been achieved. So that's one way to do it. It doesn't necessarily require an individualized tally of votes, but we can determine whether or not consensus is achieved, and it's up to the group individual members of the group to express whether they feel it hasn't been. No consensus is reached, then we can call a vote and tally each individual member's vote on a particular decision. And in this instance, according to OPAC procedures, it would be, the decision would be by majority rule of those votes. All right, so I'll open it up for any comments or feedback or questions about this voting process.
And I would really say it's a consensus process that moves to voting if consensus is not achievable.
Thanks, Andy.
Moses, could you walk us through just a scenario potentially so everybody can kind of understand and wrap our heads around this? Make sure we're all getting it. Is that a potential?
Sure. So we have proposal X, and the working group spends a set amount of time discussing, debating, deliberating about that particular proposal. Now, our initial recommendations, they included some considerations that we outlined. And those considerations are those aspects of a proposal that were identified through the evaluation process to date that we felt if the working group were to recommend that proposal to OPAC, that our part of our recommendation would be that OPAC consider those items in their recommendation. So if there was say, for example, a provision in that proposal that was either unimplementable or unenforceable or created some unfunded mandate or some other issue that arose through the evaluations and review process that felt was pertinent, that was outlined there, and we asked OPAC to consider that in their decision as an important and integral part of moving that site forward. So to craft a recommendation around something like that, we would say, is there, after discussion, is there consensus on site X with the outlined considerations as our whole cloth recommendation to OPAC on that site? So any members who felt that they weren't respected or that their ideas were not listened to, or that they hadn't had an opportunity to listen to the ideas of others, or that felt that they can't support the decision of the group, even if they would make a different decision on their own, that would be their opportunity to call that out, to say, no, I don't feel that we've reached consensus on this. And then the meeting facilitator could bring it to a vote after some discussion about that consensus if it still can't be reached. And then a vote will be called, similar to any other voting we've done in the past, and we would tally that up, and then we'll display the tally on the screen at the end of the voting, and majority will rule whether to recommend or not recommend site X with the considerations outlined.
There's one other element of this that I want to say, which is that minority kind of opinions can be expressed and communicated. So if consensus was not reached, but the majority of the vote meant that it would move forward, for those in the minority, they would have an opportunity to work with staff to help to communicate their issues of concern for why they couldn't reach consensus and translate that as well as the recommendation to OPAC. Walter, you have your hand raised.
So are we speaking hypothetically here?
Yes.
Okay. And so I'm taking this to mean is that hypothetically, we are only talking about whether to forward to OPAC or not forward to OPAC, or are we creating another category? Because, go ahead.
We are just defining the process of making a recommendation. We are actually in the next set of slides going to talk about whether or not we are going to create a third bucket of sites. But right now we're talking about what does the process look like for coming to consensus. And so,
Okay.
so a simpler example could have just been that we just had a consensus on 2 separate bullets in the previous slide, where we asked everyone if they were okay with the bullets that were on the slide, and everyone agreed. So we did reach consensus, but if there had been members of the working group that did not feel supportive of either of those, we could have had then the question called and a vote of the working group, and we would then have a majority opinion, take a perspective on that proposal. So right now we are just talking about the process. In our meeting on the 26th, we had what was a modified consensus when Frank and others said, okay, we're going to take, I think it was the 80% agreement, which meant that a certain number of votes at that certain level would dictate whether or not a site was determined to be recommended or not. We recognize that there was a lot of confusion in that, and so we are trying to simplify the process by which we are going to be creating a recommendation that's going to go to OPAC.
Okay. Thanks, Andy. And here's my concern is that it is very easy for me to understand coming to consensus on 2 choices, but it's much harder on 3. And then if we're going to talk about a way of reaching consensus, we should maybe look what we're trying to reach consensus on before we come up to a way to come to that consensus.
Yeah, our vision is that we will have a process laid out for each of the sites where we will have, and Moses, maybe you can, maybe we should go to the next slide to explain that thought process, because I feel like we're starting to conflate.
Yeah.
Let's wait and address Laurel's question
Okay, sure.
before and just truly define consensus, because it still looks like there may be some questions there, and then we can go to the next slide, which I think you're right, will help zero in on what Walter's getting at here.
Yeah, so if there are a couple of people who cannot live with the recommendation that is on the table, and we are going to make these as simple as possible for folks. And if a consensus is not reached and that there is not agreement from the full membership that the 4 bullets that are defined there under consensus were that we strove to reach those, that we would then move to a vote. But we will have a process, a stepwise procedure for each of our sites that helps us to gauge the level of consensus or support on each site for how that can move forward.
And Charlie says, yes, if we go to a vote, if no consensus, that means even if just one person.
That's correct. So if we do not have consensus among the whole group, then we will take a vote, and that vote will be informative to OPAC, and a minority perspective can be communicated. So that's the idea. We want to make this consistent with how OPAC would think about reaching consensus as well.
John says in the chat, that sounds fair to me.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions about achieving consensus? and the procedure that we've outlined here.
I think this will become more clear as we lay out our vision for how the each kind of attempt at consensus on all of our site proposals will be kind of addressed. And Dave, you have a question?
Yeah. I have a question, not about consensus, but about majority.
Sure.
Last time we had an even number of people. There's a good chance we'll have an even number, voting. And I'm assuming majority has to be 50% plus 1. So you'd have to have 7 to 5 in the case when there's 12 people.
That is how I would interpret it as well, Dave.
Okay. And the reason I asked that, just to be sure, is that we have to be careful how we frame the question, because we can't say we're voting on whether or not to move a proposal forward. I think we're just choosing one thing. Are we moving a proposal forward? And we can't have some votes be voting for moving one forward and have a different vote for not moving one forward. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It has to be kind of a consistent question.
We have to call the question consistently and allow the process to help us understand the amount of support for each of those motions.
Okay, yeah, just want to clarify. Thanks.
Well, let's go ahead and move forward then, Moses.
Okay. Scott says, will the motions have conditions attached? Well, we outlined the preliminary conditions in our previous meeting in February. And so we will have an opportunity on Thursday in our meeting to amend those conditions as necessary based on your continuing review and evaluation of those proposals, based on the feedback from the 30-day public comment period and based on the presentations given by the proposers themselves on Thursday. So that will be part of the process as to whether or not we need to add or delete or modify any of the conditions that we have outlined based on all of that information. But at the end of it, we will be recommending the proposal plus whatever considerations the group has agreed to identify for OPAC to consider in their decision. All right. So we have a choice whether to use this consensus procedure, but it sounds like everyone wants to advance to the next item before making that decision. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about it in practice, Moses, and then we can come back to this. But I want to flag for the group that we will come back to reaching consensus on the process by which we are going to make recommendations. Okay, so we have an additional item here that we want to integrate into this process. And the working group final recommendation voting or consensus and voting procedures will sort proposals as per the process we outlined long ago. We'll sort proposals as recommended or not recommended. So in recognition of the significant efforts made by the proposal teams to develop these proposals sorted as not recommended, we are suggesting that they may be subjected to an additional round of working group consensus building and voting, and potentially remand some of the not recommended proposals for what we're calling continuing consultation. This continuing consultation process would engage proposers, state agency representatives to collaboratively address the management issues that are outlined in the proposals and potentially refine proposals for a resubmission sometime in the future.
This process would ostensibly begin following the revisions to the proposal process itself that we just discussed before the break, so that we're not caught in this situation again where we're trying to revise a process while we're trying to evaluate proposals. So if we remand some of the not recommended proposals to this continuing consultation process, then the idea is to culminate that effort in the spring 2022 OPAC meeting. So the intent here is to acknowledge the merits of some of those proposals which may not receive a recommendation for OPAC, and to provide them an opportunity to collaborate with proposers, the public, state agencies, in order to address some of the site-specific management needs that the public has identified for us. So what that would mean then, and I'll walk you through the steps of the process here for consensus building and voting. It would look like this. One, we would establish consensus on a proposal with its inherent conditions for recommended status. If we do not achieve consensus, then we call a vote. So this is what we just discussed on the previous slide. So what we're recommending be added to this process then is, if it does not receive a vote of recommended, we establish consensus on the proposal to receive continuing consultation status, the side process that I just described. If consensus is not achieved on remanding it for continuing consultation, then we call a vote. And if a majority rule does not approve of continuing consultation, then we have de facto established consensus for not recommended. So we can see here, I outlined this a little bit. Hopefully this helps you understand a little bit better. So we have the working group's recommendations that we will prepare to make on Thursday. Some of those will be recommended and they will go to OPAC on May 17th of this year. Those that are not, some of the ones that are not recommended will go for continuing consultation and then be brought to OPAC in spring of 2022. The remainder that were not recommended can be resubmitted in the maintenance proposal process sometime in the future. Walter.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that this continuing consultation was not part of the original process we put out, and I just have a problem with it. It just extends the, it was not part of our original agreement on the process, Michael, and that to put this on us at this time, I just don't think it's proper.
To be clear, though, I understand your comments, Walter. We're not asking that the working group commit to this process, but rather this would be something that would be worked out with the agencies and the proposers. And I could imagine certainly inviting members of the working group who would want to engage on that process, particularly if they are engaged in certain areas of the coast where it might be relevant to their stakeholder groups. But at this time, we're not asking for an additional commitment from the working group.
So in essence, you'd be going over the working group and not using our expertise and not abiding by what we decide tomorrow? And what we originally agreed on in the process?
No, that's not my intention in that statement, but was rather to not overcommit the working group, but rather have the agencies and the proposers engage with one another to help address the issues that the proposers identified at some of these sites, and whether that ends up in a revised proposal or whether that ends up in agencies being able to address some of those issues through other means. The intention is to address those concerns that the proposers have identified, not necessarily to commit the working group to some ongoing development of proposals.
I understand, Michael. So does that mean that none of our decisions on Thursday, none of that will require the working group to put it in a continuing consultation that's just going to be up to the agency?
Well, we're asking for the working group to decide, because the working group has been the people that have put in the effort to review and evaluate these proposals. So they're the ones most familiar with the merits of the proposals. So we're asking the working group to take a vote on the ones that do not receive a recommendation, to remand them potentially for this continuing consultation based on the merits of those proposals.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about the analogy here in the future for our process, because OPAC may receive or is expected to receive in a maintenance proposal process a set of proposals, and they may not choose to establish a working group to handle those. They may ask agencies to do their feasibility and analysis of those sites, and then send the site in its composition to OPAC, who would be responsible for understanding the merits and choosing whether or not to move that forward. So this would be, in some ways, an application of our revised evaluation process. It would be working with the public and members of the different entities who have worked to craft proposals, and allowing that dialogue to continue to talk about the places that they have put proposals forward on. And so it could be very valuable for us to have that experience ahead of additional proposals coming in that maintenance proposal process. So that is one of the reasons why we felt it was potentially valuable to offer this kind of an alternate pathway. Charlie and then Walter.
I wanted to just, maybe you could walk through those bullets for who's making those decision points. Because I think Scott's question is good here about, and maybe others are confused about, if there is a continuing consultation, is that coming from the consensus of the working group, or is that coming from OPAC, or where does that come from? I think that's, so maybe just walk through those bullets in a scenario again.
This procedure is within the context of this Thursday's meeting. So for each proposal, we establish consensus on proposal X with conditions for recommended status. If no consensus, we take a vote. If it does not receive majority in favor of recommending it to OPAC, then we establish consensus as a working group on the proposal to receive continuing consultation. If no consensus on that, we call a vote. If majority does not vote in favor to remand for continuing consultation, then that is automatically established consensus on not recommended. So we would do this for each of the proposals that we are reviewing and recommending on Thursday. So at the end of the day, then we would have 3 sets of proposals. One or more, hopefully, of proposals going to OPAC for recommendation. Some proposals which are going to engage in the continuing consultation process, and some proposals which are a straight do not recommend. And that's the end of the line for those proposals in this cycle.
Walter and then Charlie.
Yeah, once again, I think if the working group's going to say they go to continuing consultation, the working group should be involved. If the agencies deem that some of these should go on for further consultation, it should be an agency decision and not put up to the working group. That's my opinion.
I believe we have the flexibility to make that recommendation, Walter, if the group wants to do that. We were very wary about further commitments of the working group beyond kind of this spring because of everybody's participation. It's been multiple years now. So we didn't want, one, to promise working group members beyond kind of this initial commitment. But again, this would need to be an OPAC supported recommendation. And if the group feels like they want to continue to do that come this fall, I'm supportive, but I didn't want to pre-commit folks to that duty.
And Andy, thanks for that. That sort of answers my question a little bit. I'm comfortable with this. My concern is the expectations around continuing consultation. Who does that, kind of to Walter's point? The idea of it being out there and flexible makes me a little concerned about there being a variety of expectations of what that is, from the public, from state agencies, from working group and OPAC. So I'm not sure. I feel like we need to some degree put some walls around what continuing consultation means so that we all have clear expectations of what that is. Particularly for OPAC, they understand recommended and not recommended. That probably should make a lot of sense to them. But then when we get into continuing consultation, the who, the how long, the what, we may want to put some parameters around that. So that's my only comment.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. And to some degree, I believe that that will be up to OPAC. But if we as a group want to spend a little bit of time and establish those kind of sideboards or a recommendation on that, I think that would be valuable. I've heard from Walter loud and clear that it should be the working group that kind of is the lead on that process. And I could certainly be supportive of that. And Scott, in the comments, you have a no off ramp. I believe that do not recommend is an off ramp. And that if we were to receive the same proposal over again, it would likely end up in the same place as a do not recommend. But the do not recommend kind of class is the no. So I guess I'm a little confused on your comment about a no off ramp.
Well, what it says, looking at the graphic, it shows that it's recommended or not recommended. If it's not recommended, then it shows two options for a not recommended proposal. One is straight to
I see what you're saying.
One to continue in consultation, and then maybe you're saying there is a third line leading out of not recommended to do not recommend.
No, I believe that that line that goes from the not recommended to the maintenance proposal process should be a dashed line. Like, we don't know if the group that proposes something is going to want to come back with a different with another proposal. I would hope that it wouldn't be the same proposal that comes in the door again, because if it didn't get recommended this time through, then I wouldn't see how that would move through at a future time. So I understand your comment about that line between not recommended and the maintenance proposal process. That is not an automatic or direct line. So I think we can modify that diagram to more clearly explain that thought.
It gets a little tricky talking about not recommended versus what hasn't received a recommendation, if that makes sense. So we have the status of not recommended, which even continuing consultation is not recommended in the sense that it didn't receive a recommended status. So it just gets tricky to refer to those two things differently, but I agree the dash line should be there.
Charlie.
Back to my previous point, and I kind of want to respond to what Walter said too, is that continuing consultation could be internalized within the working group. I don't like that as much as I think that the expertise of this working group has been met if we say continuing consultation for a site, which would lead me to believe that there's more people to consult with outside of the working group. Maybe those are stakeholders that need to be more involved in a specific proposal before it could move forward, such as a marine board, or it's like as an agency or even an ocean stakeholder. So, I mean, it could be that the working group makes some sort of recommendation around how further or continuing consultation would get at certain objectives or concerns or conditions within the working group, if that makes sense. But I think my point is I recognize there's limitations of this working group for continuing consultation, given some of the conditions that came up in our first evaluation, like limitations of certain state and federal agencies that are involved.
Yeah, Charlie, in general, I'm supportive of that because I don't want it to be a whole cloth, like remake, where the proposal that comes back isn't, for the most part, similar to what came in the door. But I don't want to pre-bake that cake so much, because if we have an evaluation process that's refined, and we heard through public comment that we want objective metrics to be a part of that, I don't want to predetermine how that is going to take place per se, because we might have significant improvements in some of the ways that we score proposals, or significant changes in the way that we score proposals, and we don't know how any particular site may do in that. So that's why I'm a little hesitant about saying too much about it, but I understand the broad idea of maybe limiting it to areas that were identified through the conditions that were maybe caused it to not fall into the recommended status. That could be one way that you constrain that universe of consultation, so to speak. So what I guess I'd like to do currently is to get a sense of the group and whether or not there is support for this stepwise process that we have laid out, including the identification of some sites that may go into this middle bucket of continuing consultation status. Because I think if there is not support, then it is a much simpler process on Thursday, but I don't think it recognizes the many hours for some sites that don't have all their kind of conditions or issues worked out at this time. Dave.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, and maybe you didn't really touch on this as much as I thought you would, but I think one of the reasons for trying to do this is that I think a lot of us recognize that one of the flaws in the proposal process was not having a capability for kind of a back and forth exchange between the proposers and the people reviewing the proposals. It was kind of, these siloed processes where people on their own develop proposals, and then the review group reviewed them on our own, without a back and forth. And I personally believe that's a flaw in the process, that there should have been a built-in back and forth, in between those two, in between the initial proposal development and the reviewers making a recommendation. And to me, this kind of corrects for that. For the ones that, what I would envision, the proposals that are, most of the way there, they're a good idea, but they have certain, issues that maybe are difficult to implement or can't really be implemented. And we need to, the working group or the agencies or both, need to work with the proposer to kind of come to some kind of agreement as to, what's the best way to proceed. In some cases, we may not come to an agreement, and then those proposals would turn into just not recommended. But I really feel like that we were missing that back and forth discussion and exchange, and this kind of gives us the chance for it. Anyway, just my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think you put into word some of my thoughts as well there. Dick.
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate Dave's comments on the back and forth. That clearly is one of the things that we were not able to enjoy, and actually, I think, help make some of these proposals that much better during the process we had and the time we've had. But I'm kind of in two minds in this. I appreciate that we're looking at this, and I think the idea that we could give a few of these proposals, for one, I guess I'll back up. I think that there are just, we all know there's just a finite number of rocky habitat sites on the coast that probably warrant designation. Not that we know everything, but there's probably a finite number. I'm not sure what that number is. And it's likely some of these sites that may not make it through the first phase of this process, this current process, may be some of those sites that are still really the best sites down the road. So they probably do warrant some additional attention. And as Dave put it, they may just need a few little tweaking and back and forth. My other thought on this, though, on the other side of it, is that I wouldn't want to see that some sites that we just keep bringing back and trying to fit these into the round peg in the square hole routine too much at the expense of other sites that are really warranted, or sites that we've not considered at all. And I think of certain sites that maybe have more of a cultural bent to them, that we've just not really seen those proposals to the same extent yet. And so I'm kind of, I don't have any solution. I just think that there's easy ways to see it both ways. And I think that there's some, I wouldn't want the current mulling over of some sites that don't make it through the very first sequence going through to OPAC soon, that we just, that they end up being the sites that we get churned over for year after year. I'll stop there.
Walter, you did have your hand raised, but I don't see any more. And then Scott. Go ahead, Scott.
I think you're muted, Scott.
Yeah, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted. I guess I don't understand why we have to have an alternate path. Understand that there are proposals that maybe got some things right, but not everything, and aren't going to go forward. But why would they not be able to simply work and have consultation outside of a formal process, but have consultation with people in parks and ODF&W and DSL or whoever, and still modify their proposal and resubmit it during the maintenance process? I guess I I have a hard time understanding why we need to put some proposals in a special category and almost like give them a leg up against other proposals that may come later on because they've had so much extra attention.
Scott, I don't know if this is a complete answer, but I think one of the reasons is because we're making an attempt to recognize some of the things that like Dave was referencing, some challenges we've had with the process, challenges that we have all endured with the pandemic and everything related to that. And so we just wanted to make sure that we've done our best to ensure that anything that may slip through the cracks didn't do so be out of negligence, and that we are able to address many of the issues that we are repeatedly hearing from the public for some of these sites, whether that's through a revised proposal or through other means. But we wanted to make sure that we're committing an appropriate effort to address those concerns. And so we thought that this would be a good way that we could expend a little additional effort, whether that's just the agencies or whether that's some broader working group that's stood up by OPAC, but to ensure that was done.
Charlie and then Walter.
Yeah, well, in recognizing what Scott just raised, and also Moses, I agree with both statements. One, we have a flawed process, right? This is the training wheels. We did not expect to get it right. But for those who have genuinely put an effort into, it seems like they should get what we decide is the fair shake. That being said, we are creating a little redundancy if there is a maintenance process that we just, I think, set a date for potentially in the fall of 2022. And then you have a continuing consultation process for other sites that's going to be landing spring of 2022. My concern is conflating the two of those things, and making clear that one thing is one and one's different. But I do recognize what Scott's raising here is like, why do two separate? Why couldn't continuing consultation be the maintenance process? And I honestly don't have a great answer for why, as long as that the due diligence was provided for those proposals. It doesn't seem like it would matter that much. But
Well, my answer to that, Charlie, is actually timing. And that is that the proposals that may go into a continuing consultation status could come to OPAC as early as the spring of 2022, when really the next time that OPAC would be thinking about approving a designation or proposal would be a year after that. So that was my understanding about kind of timing cycles here. And the groups that have submitted their proposals have indicated some time urgency associated with stewardship of these places, and I want to acknowledge that through this alternate pathway.
That's fair. I think my main concern for OPAC is that those two things don't get conflated.
Yeah.
They're and that may create the need for more space around the maintenance proposal process as far as the timeline that we just agreed upon a few slides earlier.
Yeah. So I think Walter and then Tom.
Yeah, I just want to agree with what Scott said, in that if we're going to do this continuing consultation, and time is everybody's enemy right now, we're basically giving them less time to come up with issues that we needed, or we said they needed to address, and that they could resubmit in October of 2022 and give them more time to address some of the things that we pointed out in their proposals. So I don't see a need for a third bucket. And these other ones that can need continuing consultation should just be put into the maintenance proposal process.
I guess in many ways, I'd like to hear from our proposers as to whether or not they even think that this is a good idea. They could choose if they landed in this middle bucket to not, and to have more time. But this was an attempt to acknowledge and recognize, as Dave said, some of the weaknesses in our own process, and to allow the dialogue about these places to continue on a slightly earlier timeline. Tom.
Yes, sorry, I had trouble locating my raise hand function. So I would say this whole part of the discussion has been really interesting, and I appreciate everything that's been said, Walter, Scott, Charlie, everybody. And it does seem like, as you guys have said, we're trying to address something that sounds like we have consensus on the fact that there's sort of like a missing component to our existing process, which is this sort of exchange opportunity. And it got sort of a little bit tangled up in working group function and conflict of interest and things like that. So it sounds like we're headed in the direction of trying to resolve that. And that right now it's looking like the maintenance process is likely to incorporate that sort of function. And I don't necessarily have an answer, but I'm just wondering if one of the goals might be to figure out a way to integrate this, what we're now calling a consultation process, into maybe a slow start of the maintenance process. So rather than running, I hear what Charlie's saying too, this sort of like sounds like we're going to have two things going on at the same time, which could get super confusing. And maybe we pilot this idea of consultation as part of the maintenance process, and there's still an end date, but it does allow that missing piece of the puzzle to start to be used. And then there's dates to work out, which I'm not going to try to address right now, but I'm trying to think about a way to sort of just integrate it. So instead of 3 lines, there's really 2. There's either recommended or not. And if not, there's an option to participate in this process that's a chance for us to explore that a little bit, figure out what would be helpful as we figure out what that process is going to look like in the future. Just a thought. And then maybe here's a question, Andy, for you on timing. Is there an OPAC meeting in the fall of 22?
Yes, generally OPAC meets twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. Those meetings are set, kind of dictated by the needs and the issues of the year, although we have talked about formalizing an OPAC meeting so that it always falls at a set time during the year, but that is something OPAC has not made a decision on.
Okay, and maybe I misspoke. I think I meant to say, is there an OPAC meeting in the fall of 21, this fall?
Yes, there will be an OPAC meeting in this fall.
So maybe there's this opportunity to consult that could lead to a proposal being resubmitted. And that could happen at whatever OPAC meeting it happens at. I guess I'm getting concerned that we're trying to develop a long-range process, but we have this lingering part of our process to clean up. I get that. I think the instinct is good to try to figure out how to do both, but I'm just trying to think through and maybe talk out loud or think out loud about ways to just integrate them so it's just one process. Which is sort of picking up on some of the things Walter said, some things Scott said, and Charlie is trying to like pull it together so it's a little less two things happening at once. Anyway, I'll stop there. It's not fully figured out.
Yeah, thanks for those thoughts. Charlie, I saw your hand pop up. Did you still have a comment?
I will withhold
Okay.
my comment.
Scott, do you still have a comment?
No.
Okay.
I think the one thing I just wanted to mention is that, you know, let's not get stuck into the cycle of trying to create a perfect process. There will always be flaws to some level. We can do the best we can, but if our process doesn't meet the outcomes that everybody wants, then it will be seen as flawed. And that's on all ends of the board here. So it's going to have flaws, and that's okay. We're humans. And I think we just need to be as realistic as we can as far as the expectations that we can provide for the public, and also for the decision making and the evaluation body, OPAC and state agencies.
Well, what I'd like to do, because I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts on this issue of whether or not we have a middle bucket. And, you know, maybe I can just call on some folks to try and get their perspective so that I can understand in sum total how the group is doing. So Scott, you've had your hand up. Why don't you go first?
Well, I think I've made sort of my thoughts clear. I think there's an adequate process for proposals to come back and resurface. They'd have time to make any changes that need to be made. And I can't imagine any of the state agency folks having any problem working with the proposer to say, yeah, here's what was a problem with your last proposal. Here might be one example of how you might be able to fix it. So it just seems like there's ample opportunity to make changes before the maintenance proposal process. Seems like TSP was put into place, like 25 years ago? And we've had one update now, or we're in the process of the first update, and can't see that, you know, we have to have this expedited process just because some proposals didn't make it in the first tranche of proposals going forward.
Thank you, Scott. Carrie, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share on this?
Yeah, the one thing that maybe somebody had alluded to before, but the one thing that I had emailed Moses about was sort of the state looking at the site designations holistically. So as, you know, as across the entire Oregon coast, who is looking at where it makes sense to have designations? And he said that that is going to be in process. And I feel like for me, what I struggle with is these individual designations happening without sort of that broader understanding of the Oregon coast, because I'm assuming we're not going to designate, we, the Grand We, are not going to designate every single rocky habitat square inch on the Oregon coast. I don't think that's the point of this process. So where is that sort of higher level input into where it makes sense to have sites? And I feel like if that process happens, I'm not really sure I have a clear-cut answer to your question, Andy, because I feel like that needs to happen in order to help the people who are doing these site designations to understand up and down the coast what the state is thinking. And if that happens as part of the consultation process, I think that helps, because I don't think the consultation process is necessarily saying you are going to have a successful designation at some point, but it's having a conversation about the value of that site ecologically and if it makes sense. So I guess I am thinking out loud and answering the question. I do think there's value in this consultation process if it also includes this higher level conversation with the state about those designations up and down the coast as a string and what makes sense. I struggle with this process in terms of these things being looked at individually without full context, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't know if that helps.
Charlie, you have a clarification or question?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by higher level and who you mean when you say that, but I will remind folks that this was the 3-4 year process that we just went through. Public scoping was asking the public how we should approach that. The state agencies repeatedly said if it was them, they would have implemented those sites long ago, or they would be making those management changes now. We heard the demand for a public process to do that. And that led us to creating the public process that we're in right now. So the process that we're in does require us and does charge the working group to look at the proposals that come to us in a statewide context and in the context of other sites as well, which is kind of part of our evaluation process and some of the questions that we ask ourselves in the evaluation. But this idea of like a higher level, I'm not sure like who the right body is for that necessarily, unless I'm misinterpreting something that you're asking about.
No, so yeah, so I mean, that question did come up on several of these proposals of what's adjacent to and access and all that. I feel like we are having those questions on some level, but you know, so I think Otter Rock was one of the ones that came up, or one of the other ones where there are multiple other protected areas in that vicinity, and whether or not there is a site access issue. I mean, those came up as questions, and we are asking them, the proposers, to come back with their answers, right? And so I guess my point of all of that is I feel like there's still a lot of conversation that needs to happen. And if those conversations are happening as this consultation process, I think there is value in doing that consultation, because that's coming from ODF&W and state lands and parks going, okay, well, we have talking to the proposers about why it does or does not make sense for their designation within an area if there's already other sites. It's sort of just looking at that, having those conversations more broadly, I guess. I don't think there is a quote unquote higher level in terms of agency. I mean, the agencies are here, but leading into this process, it was not necessarily what I'm hearing from public comment, not necessarily the most, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, strategic or sort of comprehensive way to have those conversations. And there seems to be conflict in terms of what they were told in some aspects, and then the comments that we gave them back conflicting with those comments that were given to them by some agency folks. So I think those things need to be resolved, and if this might be the place to do that.
I guess I'm a little confused about what we've been doing the past few years, because I feel like we did go through a full review of all the sites. We did come up with new designation categories based on that. We did hear a lot of public feedback and comment around what should or shouldn't be designated in our early scoping. I recognize that that's contrasted with a lot of the public comment that we're receiving right now. I'm trying to look at this in the context of the 4 years that we've been engaged in it, and not in the moment of the past 6 months of these sites. And I guess my opinion is that I thought we did that. And if we didn't do that, then this process, wholly failed. But I think 2 years ago we did that, and I thought we did. And I just considered that maybe not everybody has been involved for the past 4 years of this process. But if that's coming from the working group and they see that as a flaw, then I'd want to hear from others. That to me speaks to the need to back away from any proposals now and look statewide at a statewide recommendation again.
Yeah, so I guess maybe what I heard Carrie say was metrics that were associated with percentage of an area of a coast that has access from a fisheries, a recreational fishing or harvest perspective, and having a knowledge about how much of different regions of our coast have that that kind of an access issue. So maybe it's a broader set of metrics, Carrie, that you were thinking about, but maybe that's kind of what I heard. Not necessarily that we haven't gone through in an objective way and evaluated these based upon our best information that we have on hand.
No, that is not what I was alluding to at all.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, I just go back to some of the question is, should we have a consultation process? What I'm saying is that there seem to be a lot of challenges with our process in terms of how the proposals got to this point, and whether or not this turned out to be sort of a fair and equitable process with access to agency folks and all of that, and being able to get the information that they need. So if we want this to be a fair and equitable process for all of these sites, and we are trying to look at how these sites fit together, then we should be having some conversations with them specifically at these sites. And I don't think it's fair to just toss their hard work aside because there was confusion around process or there was confusion around conversations. And so I'm not saying that not all of this work was done. I'm just saying the last 6 months have been confusing and challenging, and giving them the opportunity to have these conversations. You're not guaranteeing that their site's going to move forward. You are giving them the information from the agency perspective to help them understand what they may or may not need for their site. And then they may or may not choose to move forward with another proposal. I guess we'll just leave it at that.
So Carrie, thank you for saying that. I feel like that is one of the reasons why we created this alternate pathway, was to acknowledge some of those challenges and to try and make some additional effort to work with our proposers. I'm going to keep going down the list here. I haven't heard Dave Lacey's voice, so maybe I can call you out, Dave. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I like this idea of having the continuing consultation, especially this first round, because some of the public comment that I read in the feedback from our recommendations was that they weren't able to maybe get in the hold of all the agency folks they wanted to. So I'm supportive of that. And yeah, I'm supportive of this three-step possibility: recommended, not recommended, continuing consultation.
Thank you, Dave. Andrea, I haven't heard your voice. Can I get your thoughts on this, please?
Definitely. So I think that this third bucket falls in line with conversations that we had over the past 2 years of the Has Merit Needs Work. And I think that that is pretty well in line with some of the intent that we had those conversations about, that we didn't know what was going to come in the door, and we didn't when they came in, but committing to, I guess, respect the proposer's time and all of the effort that they put in and agreeing to work on it, I don't see a problem with.
Thank you, Andrea. Sean, love to get your thoughts on this.
I'm very supportive of the process. My only concern is the time that it takes for individuals to not only the proposers, but the people on the working group and agency folks, the time commitment that they have to put in for, like reviewing and maintenance, maintenance of the proposal process. That's really my only concern. As a federal worker, I have major time constraints and can only dedicate so much time to this effort, and I don't want to slow the process down, and I want to be able to provide input, but I'm limited on time. That's it.
Thank you, Sean. Dick, love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I knew I was going to get around to me eventually here, or again. I'm still of two minds, or maybe it's three minds all of a sudden here. I think a lot of good points have been made in both directions for this. I guess I have concerns that if someone ends up with their site being not recommended, that's like some black eye that they're going to be carrying around or feel bad about for a while. And yet I think that this is part of the process that the public process that we all signed on for, is that people were nominating sites, and because of the times we're all going through with COVID and everything, people have not had the ability to have this consultation with agencies as well as other people on the working group. I mean, I can say that from my own perspective as well. So I can see a real interest at giving people another pass at it. But I do think that maybe the process going on and on, this hampers us with additional sites we want to review in the future, if there are more sites that maybe will come forward. And so in some ways, I think this was a pilot project. I go back to that this was the pilot. And I know I'm going around and around, I'm almost stalling, to be honest. But I think that I could actually be comfortable, I'll just say it, I could be comfortable with just having recommended and not recommended at this point, because that will give the both agencies as well as other parties time to maybe take a look at a different perspective of sites too. Because again, as I said earlier, I think that we did not have the benefit of many sites that were coming from a cultural perspective. We didn't have any tribal recommendations per se at this time. I know it takes time for everyone to get geared up for this sort of stuff. We have had conversations about looking at a whole coast perspective, having, I think one of the commenters, or at least more than one, talked about having another look at rocky habitat sites coast-wide. I mean, it's been since 1994. That's been 27 years. It's a long time. So it'd be great to have that kind of perspective to look at these sites again, that we haven't had that benefit. And then finally, we're looking at an evaluation process, redoing that over the summer months. So are these new sites or these relook at some sites, are they going to benefit from having the new evaluation process? A rubric has been talked about, or what? So in some ways, I think I'm leaning towards just saying, let's have some recommended sites now. The sites that didn't make it, no bad black eyes regarding those, but just that they would benefit from not only having enhanced looks at all things, but also they will, I think, have the benefit of having this more clean and clear-cut evaluation rubric as well. So I think I could live with just recommend, not recommend at this time for this pilot process.
Thank you, Dick. Tom.
Well, I guess I'll just pick up where I left off, and also where Dick just left off. And it's sounding more and more like it could be possible to integrate these two so that there's clarity at the front end and opportunity in the middle with a new process at the end. And so I think that this, I guess what I'm trying to say is that this idea of the continuing consultation concept to me was always there. But that was, in my mind, was something that was, maybe we learned some things about how to implement it. And I'm hearing what Sean was saying about time constraints and something Charlie said right at the very beginning of the discussion, which is sort of defining what that means, articulating the expectations people might have about what kind of consultation they might get. Other kinds of consultation we've talked about that Dick just mentioned, tribal consultation, consultation with people that are taking a coast-wide look, other sort of things to build into your proposal to improve it. And then setting it up so that opportunities to resubmit it for assessment or evaluation can occur. I guess it's going to be recommendations to OPAC. Those opportunities could occur whenever there's an OPAC meeting scheduled. I don't see a reason to constrain that. So there may be a way to go forward, loosen things up a little bit, go forward with an understanding that we get it, that the consultation part was faulty. We want to fix that, clarify what's available, tighten up the communication channel so that people understand what is available and what might not be. And then on the calendar side, just say like, look, these are the points at which you'll be able to submit something if you decide to rework it and address these issues. And if not, no hard feelings, as Dick said. That's kind of my thinking. And then I want to call out something, I can't remember who asked the question, but I'll ask it again. What about, I think we have proposals that we have consensus that we are not recommending that. And we're like, that's the end point. And I don't know, it seems mean, but I feel like it's meaner to not just say that, like, this is not a good proposal, we don't support it, rather than saying, oh, that door to keep working on it until you get it right is going to stay open for everyone forever, might be doing more harm than good. And I know that that might be mean of me to say that, but I'm trying to just not lead people on and just be realistic. So those are my thoughts, kind of trying to refine what I said earlier. And maybe there's a way to treat this middle place that we're in as a lead in to a revision to the process and an opportunity to pick up some things that are pretty clear right now, like this whole consultation thing seems like, yeah, it's probably going to end up in there somewhere. And but like Dick said, I think we have to be careful because at some point there's going to be this new decision-making process, and we don't want to end up in a position where we're doing two things at once. That's just going to be even more confusing for people. So maybe, I don't know, feels like there needs to be some kind of hard stop somewhere in here. We stop doing what we're doing now and start doing something different. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Tom. Laurel, how about you?
Sure. I think I could go either way at this point. At the beginning of the conversation, I was leaning towards, having a middle pot. Seems like a good idea, but willing to go with the group's decision, consensus. Could go either way.
Thank you, Laurel. Dave Fox, I should add.
Yeah, lot to chew on here. So to me, I'm hearing that pretty much everybody said there needs to be some kind of continuing or some kind of consultation process somewhere. So really it seems like the choice is, do we have a process for some of the existing proposals that would occur between now, with the potential recommendations going to OPAC in spring of 2022, or do we delay all those and maybe come on with those and maybe some other new proposals in fall of 2022, have the consultation for a possible OPAC presentation, spring of 2023. I mean, that's how I'm kind of seeing it in my head. So it's really, to me, it's really, do we do it this year or do it late next year? It's really, I think, part of what we're differentiating here. And I could really go either way with it myself. The thing I'm struggling with is there are probably, I won't name them, but 3 or 4 proposals that probably aren't going to make the cut in their current form, but do have a chance of getting through, kind of a consultation process. And people put a lot of work into those, and it would be nice to, kind of bring those forward in some way sooner rather than later. But whether it happens this summer or happens, winter of 2022, I don't know. There's a big difference between the two. So sorry, I don't have an exact conclusion there, but I'm willing to go along with a group decision on it.
Yeah, I think we have now made it around the horn through everyone. Moses, do you have any thoughts you want to share before I give my perspective?
No, nothing substantial. I think this has all been good conversation for the working group to have. And it seems to me that we don't have consensus on what to do. So we should probably take a vote on it. I think maybe that's what you're thinking too, Andy, but correct me if I'm wrong there.
Well, I think the one element and the one thing I haven't heard from is receptiveness of our proposers to enter into a continuing consultation process. I think Dave is right. I think that there's a subset of the sites that could come back to OPAC on an earlier time cycle if they went through that process. There's a little bit of ambiguity in that process, and I believe that results in some uncertainty from folks. And I would lean towards being inclusive in this manner and trying to support that, but I have heard concerns about people's time, and I want to recognize that. So one potential path forward for us is to listen to public comment at the end of the day, to chew on this, and to make a decision as a group at the beginning of the meeting on the 29th. As a way to hear public comment and be able to incorporate that into our thinking. So that's my thought. I saw Charlie's hand pop up.
Well, I was thinking the same around public comment, but I was thinking I would prefer us to make this decision today. Yeah, I don't want us to have this looming over us.
Yeah.
Nor do I want it to be looming over the expectations of a proposer who's going to be in a Q&A on Thursday with this working group. So it would be good to have those, have that clear going into the meeting.
Moses, did we have a time identified for public comment today? Because I think we might be a little bit ahead of that if we did.
Yeah, it should have been at 4:45. It would be the last agenda item. So we are about an hour ahead as far as that's concerned.
We do have a number of our proposers on the line, so I'm leaning towards opening up a public comment session and then having the working group factor that into our thinking about how we move forward on this item. Is the group comfortable with that, or do we want to make a decision as a group now, I guess?
Well, as a point of process,
Yeah, look, can we,
maybe just put in the chat if you're not comfortable with us holding public comment now. I'm not seeing any discomfort. For those members of the public that are listening in, I don't believe we're asking you to reserve your comments for this specific item, knowing that you may have other things you want to comment on. But do note this discussion, and that is why we're opening up public comment early, is that we're seeking your input before we come to any kind of conclusion on this as a working group. So I'll turn it back over to you, Andy or Moses.
Yeah, so I believe we have consensus to hear public comments, so we are going to do so. If you would like to provide a public comment, please raise your hand or send me a chat, and I will make that possible. Okay, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks everybody in the work group for providing the opportunity for public comment. And I will say that there are other members of the public that took more of a lead role in putting together proposals, although I did help. But I will address that continued consolation question, but first I'll provide some other testimony. First, I'm really excited to see such overwhelming support of the proposals. When you factor in the Audubon Lincoln City petitions individually, I tally up 345 supporting, 11, and then 11 do not support. So that's almost 97% support. So I think it's important for the work group to keep that in perspective for the rest of today and for the meeting on Thursday. I don't think downplaying the comments that are like quote unquote cut and paste is something. I think you just need to be careful about that, because individual people still did make a decision to put their name on something and submit it. So I think that they're showing agreement and consensus to what others are already supporting. So. And regarding the continuing consultation, I can't speak on behalf of all the proposers, but I do appreciate that that new category for this initial phase, since, as you all have acknowledged, there have been some challenges with the process. And I think Dave Fox and Carrie and others that talked just before kind of hit the nail on the head, saying that there really wasn't that formal back and forth process, and so I think that allows that. It helps for this round, and so and just knowing what the other proposers are facing, and knowing that they probably don't want to wait a whole year to circle back to those proposals. I would be supportive and of that continuing consultation. I would like to hear from other folks on the line if there are other proposers on the line. So I think that's it for me. I'll be done.
Thank you, Joe. Does anybody else want to provide a public comment? And again, if you want to, you can put a note in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Looks like Kent, go ahead. You should be able to speak, but you are on mute. There you are.
Hello to all the work group, and I appreciate all your time. This is Kent Doty with Lincoln City Audubon. We haven't obviously had the opportunity to discuss it within our group, our core team, but I believe that the idea of a continuation has a lot of merit, given the thousands of hours that proposers have put into these proposals, just as much as the work group in many hours. I think that there's a lot of investment in it, and not only an investment on those that worked on the proposal, but an investment in the community. There's an expectation from our stakeholders that have looked to this and they're expecting. So that's a little bit of a momentum, a push for us to keep if we were in that for a continuation. The other thing is with the continuation, the one concern with the maintenance is, I understand we are going to, this was a initial process. There were a lot of challenges. We all encountered some struggles, and it's nice to hear the acknowledgement, I think, on everybody's side that the back and forth communication is something that we want to rethink and set some formats on it. But with the maintenance process, what I'd be concerned about is we end up at that same place of no real format to communicate with the agencies. Whereas the continuation, I would anticipate that there would be some fairly clear understandings of these are our considerations that are still outstanding, and it's fresh in everybody's minds that they can have a constructive dialogue to resolve and solve those and move forward, or to say, no, I think we're at a point. So I think the continuation offers, it has a lot of merit in terms of meaningful conversation and a timeline that respects not only the proposers, the work group, but also the community that's behind all of these proposals. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kent. Is there anyone else who would like, Steve Griffiths, you should be able to speak once you unmute.
Yes, thank you. I'm Steve Griffiths, and I'm with the Audubon Society of Lincoln City. And I just wanted to express support for what Kent Doty just said about the value of allowing continuing consultation. That's something we missed in the proposal development process. And if we had been allowed to consult with some of you folks, we would have had a much more efficient and more productive process, I think. So I would urge you to support that. And lastly, I want to thank you for including our petition and including the comments that were made as part of that petition process. So thank you for doing that.
Thanks, Steve.
Is there anyone else who would like to provide comment? Okay, I'm not seeing any other comments come in, Moses. So why don't we, Charlie?
I just want to recognize it looked like Jamie Faraday had some stuff in the chat. I didn't know if that intention was for public comment or not. I think it's to both the panelists and the attendees.
Yes, I did see that. I'm a little bit confused, Jamie, because the two statements are together kind of contradictory. And let me make it possible for you to.
Thanks, Jamie. I was looking for clarification there too.
Well, like I mentioned in the first chat, that I would be leaning toward leaving out the step which affords continuing consultation status, and wondering why couldn't consultation be afforded to those that do not pass, get the non-recommendation status.
I see. I think that they could be. It's just not an express commitment through our process to do so. And I think that there is some value in that. Jamie, do you still have another comment?
No, that's it.
Okay. Okay, members of the working group, I want to provide you a little bit of opportunity to let me know whether or not comments that were heard have changed your perspective. I saw Tom's hand flash and then Charlie's on kind of our path forward as a working group.
Yeah, I'll try to boil it down here based on what I just heard and what we've been discussing all along. I think if I sort of hold my hand up and cover the parts with the 4 extra boxes to the right, on Thursday, every proposal is either going to be recommended or not. And I think that's a really good sort of stopping point for this first phase of the process, because everything that happens after that is going to be work that's done with proposals that have not been recommended, whether they've been created or not. Some have been created, some haven't. There's all kinds of world of possibilities after Thursday. But on Thursday, the only thing that's really going to happen is some proposals are going to go forward and be recommended. And the rest is what we've been talking about, like then what? And what I'm hearing is nobody has said that they are against the idea of the proposers that have proposals in place right now that don't get recommended, or future proposals that get put together in the future. Nobody has said that they should not get this better version of consultation to refine their proposal and make it better and maybe submit it again in the future. So it feels to me like that's not really a designation. That's not really a third type. It's a, I don't know what to call it. It's a process. It's a part of the process that we're talking about. And it sounds to me like we just really need to define what that means and make sure it meets the needs of people who are working on proposals today, tomorrow, and in the future. So maybe if we focused our attention on what we mean by that and address the concerns about it, and then just not try to confine it any more than that, but just let people know these are the expectations you can have for what is available to you through the working group, through the agency, through DLCD, etc. Maybe there's others, you know, maybe we should have other conversations about different kinds of consultation and really refine that part of the process. And that's something that will probably continue to be refined in the future and end up in our new proposal process in the future. But it definitely needs to be worked on now based on what we're hearing. That way we can have those proposers get that clarity and get that support as they proceed to work on their proposal if they choose to do that, and get ready for a resubmitting at some point. And we could solve that problem sooner rather than later and not actually have to create another sort of separate track somehow, because we're all agreeing right now. So far, I don't think there's anybody who's against doing that. It's just a matter of how we talk about it. So that's my thinking on that, just to try to like just define things a little bit. And part of it is for me to define it in my head. like what's happening on Thursday and that's what's happening after Thursday. That's all I have.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Does anyone else have thoughts or reflections? Charlie.
I don't disagree with what Tom just said. I was thinking about this a little differently. And what I hear from the public and what I think about in the process and everything that's gone into the, work of individuals is, there's good ideas, there's bad ideas, and there's good ideas that aren't ready. And not recommended doesn't tell you whether or not you have a bad idea or a good idea that's just not ready yet. So I feel like we gotta somehow or another allow for the merit of a proposal to be demonstrated if it's not recommended. The human needs and relationships that need to be created and established for further looking at that site. I mean, I look at a lot of these sites, and where I see opposition, I actually see opportunities for relationship building. And I would like to help point people in that direction rather than just say not recommend. And then I also think it gives some expectations where wildly in this process, the expectations have not been met, on all different ends of things. And so at least gives some level of expectation other than just not recommend. So I guess I'm saying, I agree with what Tom's saying. We're in this recommend or not recommend category, but I would like to provide some level of merit around not recommended. And what that continuing, that might be that continuing consultation. I mean, and I could see the considerations that we would want to get into if we wanted to do that. To me, I think about agency capacity. Could the agencies continually consult on, 8, 9, 10 different proposals? Probably not. But is there a reasonable number there? And what's the capacity of that? So how many? And then what are the expectations for both the proposers in engaging in that process and for those evaluating and helping with the continued consultation? So I don't know if that helps at all. I think I'm kind of pointing back towards what Tom is saying. I'm in the recommend or don't recommend or do not recommend bucket with some level of merit coming out of the do not recommend in continuing consultation or an understanding for expectations.
Well, I guess I'm challenged to find a path that provides that third kind of category, Charlie, in between do not recommend and recommend, but that acknowledges the has merit, need work kind of status, and feel like if we don't have that middle option, then you don't provide in any way, shape, or form clarification on whether it's really do not recommend because it was incomplete or it was a bad idea versus it was do not recommend and there were only a couple of issues associated with it actually being able to be forwarded to OPAC for their consideration. So without trying to, and that was, one of the reasons why I, worked with Moses to try and create this framework where we as a group could try and communicate clearly to OPAC how much support the site had from a merit perspective, as well as, the quality of the idea. So without this second consensus kind of opportunity, I don't know how we get to that providing that information back as a part of our process.
Yep, fair enough. I'd like to hear just around with the working group again. I'm sorry, I'm belaboring this, but we have time and I want buy-in before we go into this meeting, and I want clarity for folks as best we can. So I'd like to hear from everybody.
Yeah, okay. Well, let me go down the list again. So let me come back to Carrie.
Are you sure you want me going first? I am still in favor of a consultation process. I know that needs some work in terms of what that means and looks like exactly, but I'm still in favor of it.
Okay, Moses, you have your hand raised. Did you want to provide?
Yeah, well, just after listening to everyone's feedback about it, public and working group alike, I think Tom had a great point, that it seems that nobody really disagrees that there should be some sort of consultation with proposers. I think we're all kind of feeling differently about where that needs to occur in the process and what it might look like, and that I think is really where we should try and focus maybe the rest of this decision, the rest of this discussion, where we agree about it. So if the difficulty is understanding where the process should occur, whether it's through a vote on Thursday or whether it's at the beginning of the next phase of the process or whether it's somewhere in between, maybe what we should do then, because we are talking about delaying revisions to the proposal evaluation process, and that's something that we wanted to consult or engage proposers in the public with, to understand how we can revise that process and improve it, which it sounds like that process, the revised process in the future, should include this some level of consultation before, during, or after. And maybe the decision about how to handle that consultation and which proposals, how we treat rather the proposals that don't receive a recommendation on Thursday, maybe we could defer to that part of the process, that revising evaluation process, and understand then better how consultation will proceed, what the guardrails are on that process, and the expectations for agencies, for the proposers, for any potential working group or OPAC members involved in it. So maybe that could be one way we could address this and settle our kind of discomfort as a group with how to treat it. That we go back to where we did agree and say, hey, you know what, we know that the process has flaws and weaknesses and that there's challenges to the way we structured it, and we need to have a sit down and really work through that. And one thing we do agree on is that there should be a consultation process somewhere in there. And we already have a bunch of proposals that have had a tremendous amount of work put into it. So maybe in revising and reshaping that process, we can determine what to do with the remainder of those proposals that don't move forward in spring of 21. Does it make sense to everyone?
So let me try and restate what I think I heard you say, which is that the opportunity to structure kind of a continued consultation with sites that are not recommended on Thursday would happen following the work that's done to revise the proposal evaluation process.
Not necessarily following, but it's that proposal revision process where we would define what consultation really, how it really works and what it really means. And once we had that defined, during that revision process, we could say, okay, now that we know what the process is going to look like for consultation, which of the not recommended proposals aligns with that new structure, that new process, and then we could decide how will we treat those proposals. Do we want to put them through some continuing consultation at that time based on this newly defined consultation process and evaluation process? So we leave that decision as to which proposals are being consulted to that decision will come later, essentially.
I still think there's value in having our working group have a measure of support associated with the ideas, given that we're not going to want to workshop all of those things if some of them clearly did not meet the bar for a submission that we were asking for. Well, let me keep going down the list here because I think Charlie wanted to hear from folks. Dave Fox.
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute. My mouse wasn't responding. Yeah, a lot more to chew on. Like I said before, I like the idea of, some form of continuing consultation for, some of these sites, the current proposals, and to do that, prior to waiting to, the October or the fall of 2022 maintenance process, to still keep them as kind of a separate group. And the way I look at it is, we could do a continuing consultation with 3 or 4 sites now, or it's not now, but over the next several months. And then when the maintenance process comes along, maybe there's 5 new sites that get proposed, to do those 5 then. Or we could wait for the whole thing and do all 8 or 9 sites. Either way, all the sites will probably, have some form of continuing consultation. But based on what Moses said, though, I like the idea of, having that time this summer to define more precisely what we mean by continuing consultation. And then like right after we define that, to do the whatever sites we decide on, out of the current proposals. And maybe that happens, maybe that doesn't happen in time for the spring 2022 OPAC meeting. Maybe it has to wait till the fall 2022 OPAC meeting, but to have it still, ahead of the maintenance process. So it's really just kind of a staged, continuing consultation on current proposals, and several months to a year later, we have some continuing consultation on some new proposals that come in. So I guess that could conclude, a conclusion from that is that I am in favor of having on Thursday's meeting have there be a vote for the non-recommended ones, or a consensus / vote for the not recommended ones, to either be, some form of continuing consultation, or, truly not recommended. Did that make sense? Sorry, I rambled a bit.
It did. Thank you, Dave. Laurel.
Sure, I agree with a lot of what everybody said. I think there's a need to flag those that the timing, is flexible in my mind, but some way to flag those that have merit, needs work category now, because the working group spent a lot of time like looking at them and digesting them. And if we wait a really long time, then that might require more time with them, which will be necessary anyway. But even if we change the timeline, I think there's value in flagging those. These ones are incomplete. Those are off the table for now. Come back with a complete application. But there are some that I don't think we're going to get through all the issues in whatever time we have allocated per proposal on Thursday. But it's helpful to flag those ones.
Thank you, Laurel. Andrea.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think, let's see, how do I say this? So I think that there's definitely value in the continuing consultation category. And I think that maybe going through that exercise might help inform some of the process improvements that we might want to consider, and having that open dialogue. For example, it might help us like refine the questions that we need to ask. That way we get better proposals in next round. And I definitely want to be respectful of the time that everyone put in it, and agree with Laurel that if they sit too long, it's not going to do anybody any favors in having to re-review them. However, that being said, things on both sides, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. You broke up, at least on my connection, for a little bit, but I think I got the gist of your thoughts there. Dave Lacey.
I still support the continuing consultation, especially for this first round, because I feel like that's what people were expecting, and there was a lot of uncertainties, and some people felt like they didn't get enough time with agency staff. I know agencies were tried to give them as much time as they could, but maybe some people didn't get it what they needed. So I think I am still in support of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Scott McMullen.
Yeah, I don't know. Seems like we're sort of stuck here. Maybe we should just send them all to OPAC with varying levels of recommendation. We strongly recommend, or we sort of recommend.
Thanks, Scott. Tom, I don't know if we've heard on this round here. Where are you?
Where am I? No, I think this is all good discussion, and it's getting us closer to what I think things might look like in the future, but we still have to sort of fix things today. So I'm on board with that. You know, I keep hearing this term come up that is echoing for me back to a time when we had this discussion way back when we began to set up the process. And that was, I think it's Laurel who used it last, has merit, needs work. And I think, I don't know, I feel like that's clearer to me, because a consultation is a process. It's not like a defining, you know, it doesn't define the proposal, and it's causing me to be a little bit confused. I'm okay with us saying, here's the ones we clearly recommend. They go out the door, they're moving on. There's some that we don't, and here's some that have merit but need work, and this is how that work happens. I think that's closer to me, it's closer to a clear sort of way of describing the three pots. And I think it probably was a mistake when we abandoned that idea in the beginning, because here it comes back to haunt us anyway. And now we're trying to use it, use that defining term without using it, by describing something that's really a process that is ultimately, sounds like it's going to be part of the process in the future. So maybe we should just bite the bullet and say, sort of like what Scott was just saying, there's three types, and type A gets recommended, type B gets some extra work, type C does not get recommended. And then we define the terms. And just to be clear, my position on it is that I don't think the consultation process is some new thing. I think what we've heard is that consultation was occurring. It may or may not have been sufficient, but we'd like more of it. And I don't see any reason that that's something that couldn't just continue. Like, I'm not sure it needs a whole lot of thinking about, you know, at some point probably clarify that for the future process. But for now, just sounds to me like more of something that we got some of, but not enough. And if we got more, we could move a proposal, maybe move it from not recommended to recommended. And there's only one way to find out, which is do it. So that's my take home on it, what I could be comfortable with.
Thanks, Tom. So I think I have Sean, Walter, and then Charlie on this round of thinking.
Okay, this is Sean. Yeah, again, I'm in favor of the process, the way it stands, including the I don't know if it's the correct term anymore, consultation or has merit, needs work, whatever. But I think we're kind of making it harder than it needs to be, the process. I think we've pretty much come up with, as we reviewed the proposals, we see the ones that are, that we're going to recommend, that ready to go as they are, and we've seen the ones that need some work, and we've provided comments of ways to improve those proposals, and leave it up to the proposer to make those changes. And I think that's the biggest part, is our recommendations of the changes to the proposers that needs to be addressed. And it's kind of like we're saying we're the final say here. And I don't know if I'm really comfortable with that, or where the working group is saying, okay, you need to do this, this, and this before we can recommend it. And I'm not sure if that's the right way to go about it, but I think we've still been doing a good job at it by providing recommendations. But all in all, I'm in favor of the process and continuing consultation and working with proposers to make their proposals better.
Thank you, Sean. Walter, and then Dick, did you get a chance to go the second time around? Put you in the lineup as well.
Yeah, I'm still for the two categories. Consultation is going to happen whether or not we recommend them or not. Even proposals that are recommended will need recommendation. And I think we're just putting an extra step in there when we're all acknowledging already that consultation will be continuing regardless of whether they're recommended or not.
So Dick, and then Charlie.
Thanks, Andy. Well, I guess a couple things, as always. I think a couple, when someone brought up the calendar, maybe it was Moses, I'm not sure who, it starts looking like if we don't even address the consultation efforts for these non-recommended sites until after we go through the process updating over the summer months, and then everything's going to take time. Looking at a calendar, I think in some essence, in some ways, these sites that are undergoing consultation may more or less be falling in line with almost the next maintenance round, as we're calling it anyway. So it's kind of hard to see how much of a leg up they get, although I do understand that they've maybe missed a little time here with obviously the lack of consultation we've all acknowledged over the last year. Secondly, a second point is that, and I know we're not going to be talking about individual proposals today. We're going to save that for Thursday, but I just want to say that the proposers who commented back on the site recommendations we made, people did an amazing job of addressing concerns. I think basically it's pretty lopsided consultation, but I think people clearly responded to that, and so they can clearly, I think it's a good thing. So we certainly have seen, just in a little small examples we've had here in the last month, that the recommendations we made and some of these acknowledgements that the proposers made, and some people compromise some of their some of their goals and things, or what they were looking for in their sites in that short amount of consultation. So I think that there is clearly some huge benefits that can be gained on proposals by just a little bit of back and forth. So I guess I had stated originally that I thought we should just go with a two-step recommend, not recommend. I'm going to modify that, acknowledging that the not recommend for these few that still have something warranted in them, some aspects of them that still can go forward, acknowledging that it's not going to happen until likely this working group has done our work. It's going to fall on the agencies come fall or later on. So I think that that's just going to be an ongoing effort that they're going to be shouldering, I would think, down the road.
Thank you, Dick. So Charlie, I think you're the last one here to go on.
I have nothing further to add to this discussion of merit. I think all that's been said has been said. I was trying to listen to where we had consensus, and that's why I wanted to hear. What I was able to hear is that we have consensus that a binary decision is limiting. And there's consensus that both recommended and not recommended have some level of weight to them. But we don't have consensus on whether or not we should just rip the Band-Aid and go with recommended, not recommended, or whether or not we should have this middle category. I feel like we're weighted towards the three options right now. But we have not gone to a vote. So that's what I heard, and correct me, or I open it up to others if they heard something different.
No, Charlie, that's what I heard after this discussion. And
it's
so did
lengthy, but a little circular.
Yep.
That's okay, and I think necessary. And I do want to, Sean mentioned this and say this, we don't have the last word. This is a recommendation to OPAC. And OPAC really has the last word. And so just keep that in mind. We make the recommendation and the best recommendation we can, and with the best clarity that we can to OPAC. But we owe it to the proposers, I think, to offer that clarity as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to take this back to our decision-making model, which is that I believe we do not have consensus on whether or not to include this third bullet. So if somebody would like to make a motion that we as a group should vote on this process, which includes a continuing consultation step for all that term maybe is not the optimal, which I understand, but is in line with HAD's merit needs work, and we are committing to working with them on that middle bucket. Does somebody want to make a motion that we seek consensus on 3 bullets moving forward for our decision-making process on Thursday?
Yeah, I'll make a motion that we should do what you just said, Andy. I think we owe it to the proposers, and it would be a disservice not to.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor that we as a working group will use this 3-step consensus proposal recommendation process as outlined on the slide. Do I have a second? Or let me pause. Do I have consensus, recognizing the previous slide means that all the 4 conditions may have been met, that you've been listened to, that you've heard others' opinion, that you might have made a different decision had you been acting alone. Does the group have consensus to move forward with this process?
The process or the vote, Andy?
What I am trying to ascertain whether or not there is consensus with the motion on the floor. And I guess maybe I should have done a second. So my apologies for the Roberts rules violation there, but. Was there a second to Dave's motion?
This is Dave Fox. I'm willing to second it, but I do have a question for clarification.
Sure, Dave, go ahead.
So I think everybody agreed that there should be some kind of consultation sometime, right? So I think we have to be more specific if we're voting on that consultation happening before the maintenance process or kind of after the maintenance process starts.
We are making a decision that it would happen before the maintenance proposal starts,
Okay.
as that is what
Okay.
is described on the slide here.
Yeah, for clarity, it's as described on this slide, Dave. We're kind of back to that point, and for everyone else's clarity about what we're talking about.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Do we have any other discussion?
Yeah, Andy, this is Walter. I'd just like it put on the record that this is being voted on by the working group, but this original idea was not brought forth by the working group, was brought forth by the DLCD staff.
Sure.
And that is for the record.
Mm-hmm. So do we have consensus to move forward with the process as defined on this slide here? And please enter into the chat if you do not agree with a consensus of the working group on this slide.
Consensus or vote, Andy?
I'm not asking for a vote right now. I'm trying to see if we have consensus on moving this process forward for how we are going to vote on proposals on Thursday.
So Andy, can you clarify? I thought we were voting that whether or not we were going to have a 3-part and not just a 2-part.
We are. What I'm saying, I don't, the consensus model means that after hearing what everyone has said, we still try and reach consensus, but I'm asking for objections to the consensus motion.
Then I object. I think we should vote.
Okay, then let's go ahead and vote on using the 3 bullets as defined in this slide as our decision-making model on Thursday. So please put in the chat for attendees and panelists whether or not you agree with the proposal process as described on this slide. And you can say yes, as described on the slide, or no.
Excuse me, Andy, I have a clarifying question, just to make sure I really understand this.
Yep.
So it looks to me like with the 3 bullets you have, each proposal comes up and gets we try to establish consensus for recommended. And if it is not recommended, then we would have a second effort to try to establish consensus on the not recommended status.
On continuing consultation for that site.
What the slide says is not recommended, and the slide shows not recommended meaning continued consultation. But it sounds like we're having 2 different consensuses, one on the ones that are recommended and a second one for that same proposal to see if it qualifies as going in the not recommended status which would lead it to continuing consultation.
No, the second attempt at consensus would be to try and understand if the working group agreed that the site has merit, needs work, and should be designated in this continuing consultation status, which would put it in a, and if there's not support there, then by default, kind of consensus is established that it is not recommended even for further consultation.
Yeah, and I think it's just a little confusing though, when we keep saying not recommended means either not recommended but continuing consultation, or not recommended and you're out. So maybe we should change the, I mean, I think it would be clear, and if we're going to vote on this, it seems like it would be clear to make that distinction. Consensus to move forward with more consultation, but not recommended to OPAC yet, or not recommended, you're out, start over, or modify your proposal and resubmit, or whatever you want to do.
So you are, okay, so if I understand, you are saying the working group would recommend continuing consultation on its own line, separate from recommended, as a recommended site that OPAC should move forward. I guess I'm trying to clarify the confusion.
I think as a point of process, what Scott is offering is the same thing that Laurel put in the chat, that there's three buckets really.
Yeah. Okay.
And I mean, I think it's visually, it might make better sense to display it that way. As a point of process, we were in the middle of a vote.
Yeah.
And something new has been introduced, and so
yeah, let's.
I want to pause, and I want to figure out if we continue in the vote and the motion that's been on the table here, and then is there potentially a second motion happening right now for another? So I will turn that back over to you guys and to facilitate that.
Dave has his hand up.
Yeah, so I see Scott's comment as like an addendum, or like a note on what the original vote was intended. So Dave, Lacey, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm happy to strike my motion, and then we can do another one here if that makes things easier, because it looks a little more clear now that Moses changed that slide a bit.
Agree, the slide helped a little bit there, but I would want to go back to Scott.
Yeah, I think this is a easier vote on something that's based on the slide. People are going to be able to look back at the slide and see what we meant, rather than know it just from only know it based on the contents of the conversation. I think it's good to have the slide be very clear.
Okay, and can you clarify for me what was changed on the slide? Like maybe my internet is not.
For the working group receives proposal recommendations here. Everyone can see can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. So one set at this step receives a recommendation that goes to OPAC this year. The second set, it has not received the recommendation. So rather than saying not recommended, which is confused with the final endpoint here. So rather than saying not recommended, I just changes does not receive a recommendation. And then if it didn't receive a recommendation, then we take a second vote or consensus to determine if it is remanded to continuing consultation, or if it goes out to a future process.
Okay, thank you. Laurel, you have your hand up.
We had also discussed, that should, well, you did change it to a dotted line, but somehow clarifying somewhere that dotted line doesn't necessarily mean it, goes to the maintenance process.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
I think that it might be more clear to say that that's sent, back, it's to the proposer. it's back in their court, whatever they want to do with that in the future.
I agree.
I agree with that as well. Okay, I think, Moses, are you making some changes there?
I just changed that last
Got
box.
Okay.
Is that clear to everyone now?
Yeah, and you may add to that box, just I think it might provide some comfort for individuals that may end up in that spot. Working group, part of our recommendation will be a rationale around that. And so to some degree, that might be reassuring for an individual that had a proposal that didn't. They'll have that rationale that, oh, it was incomplete, or it didn't get the right amount of public support, or whatever it is.
Okay, Laurel, do you still have your hand raised?
Yeah, I had put something in the chat about the line between continuing consultation and OPAC. I think it needs to be clear that just if it goes into continuing consultation, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to get recommended to OPAC. It could, or that's a question, I guess, is I think that that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to get a recommendation to OPAC. Or
I think it's better to think about it more like continuing consultation doesn't necessarily mean that we're even working on a proposal. It means we're trying to address the issues that have been identified in the proposals. And whether that means reworking a proposal to something new that we then bring to OPAC another time, that's one possible outcome. But it could also mean that agencies review how they manage that site and negotiate with other capabilities to address the problems rather than necessarily a designation. So I think continuing consultation to me is broader than just tweaking proposals. It's trying to solve problems. But I'll leave it to my agency representatives to correct me if that's not their understanding of it.
Okay, so we had, oh, go ahead, Dave.
Oh, I was just going to say, at least what I interpreted Laura was saying is that if you just look at that line on the chart, it looks like if you get into the continuing consultation category, you automatically go to OPAC. And I could see the continuing consultation in some cases being a failure, right? And you don't have any solution or any recommendation for OPAC. So just to make it clear that it's not a guarantee of everything being resolved.
that was my point. I don't know how to indicate it on the slide though.
So we would have a note that green arrow between the spring 2022 OPAC and an OPAC is a potential. It's not a guarantee.
Would it be that arrow? That arrow is just to indicate where in the process it is. But I think Laura, Dave was talking about the line, or really both of them.
Yeah.
So I made this a dashed line there to indicate it won't necessarily be an outcome of a new proposal going to OPAC. It could be other outcomes.
Or maybe we could make a circle back to from continuing consultation, circle it back to the very beginning, working proposal recommendations, and then we could recommend or does not receive a recommendation.
Andrea. Sorry, I'm staring at the process diagram here.
No, you're good. And maybe this will simplify the idea of like fixing it. So in my head, I'm going to talk this out. We're making a recommendation to OPAC. As part of our recommendation to OPAC is that they have merit, sorry, and need work, and that we're going to keep working on it. Maybe it does make sense that we would go back to OPAC in spring, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our recommendation would be to adopt the site, but we would we've continued to work on it and this is where we're at now, kind of a thing. So I think that maybe it does make sense that it would go to OPAC, but not necessarily guaranteeing that that everything would be resolved and that it would be recommended. Maybe we spend the time and maybe then it's not recommended. I'm not sure what will come out of the process of continuing consultation, but maybe it does make sense that it would go back because OPAC is supposed to make the final determination anyway.
And then to piggyback on that, Andrea, I think the other thing is too, when we were talking about this and making this diagram, the thinking was that the working group wouldn't exist. So any proposals necessarily then would go straight to OPAC for their consideration by spring of 2022. So I think it seems to be some folks I think we're having a difference of that assumption of whether or not the working group would be making recommendations versus proposals would just be submitted.
Laurel.
I just heard some indication from members of the working group that they feel like that would be valuable to have that going forward, but not from everybody. So I don't know if that's a discussion point at OPAC at some point, but I don't know that we're going to resolve it right now.
I feel like that's a potential decision point for OPAC to make, is whether or not they want to keep the working group to help with that process. And I think that that's the right place for that decision to be. Charlie.
Yeah, I agree that the place for that is within OPAC, and this working group, a lot of these members have been on for 4 years now, and I'm sensitive to that. And then there's people who've phased in and phased out of OPAC in that time, and so I think the continuing consultation is more about deep information that's beyond this working group and what we're able to achieve in our limited capacity, and that depth needs to happen and go straight more to OPAC, I think. And if they want to create another working group, that's on OPAC, I think, at that point. But I would hope that we can define continuing consultation in a way that allowed it to either be recommended or not recommended to OPAC from there.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie.
And a time check, we're at 4.
Yep, I know. We need to make a decision here. So does anybody want to put a motion on the floor to use this decision-making process as described on the slide on Thursday as our framework?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that again. Stay.
Okay, there's a motion on the floor. Is there a second?
I'll second the motion.
Okay, Andrea seconds the motion. I believe we will not have consensus based upon our earlier vote, but I will, Walter, do you have an objection to using this process?
I'd still like to vote yes, Andy. Thank you for asking.
Okay, then go ahead, please, working group members, and enter your vote. And Charlie's recommending that we change a bubble there in the slide. So everyone please factor that into, so OPAC bubble, say recommended or not recommended to OPAC spring of 2022.
We don't need to put that in there if it's going to open up further discussion.
All right.
I was trying to help Laurel out a little in some of her
All
chat
right,
before.
let's vote as to what is on the slide, please. Does everyone have their vote in?
I think we need Tom and Dave Fox.
Okay.
Oh, I typed mine in. I agree.
Oh, maybe sorry, I missed.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the motion carries. I see 2 noes, and we will document that in our process document. Thank you all. Moses, you have one more slide, I
was
think.
just gonna share the
Okay.
vote for the record.
Yep.
Okay.
Walter and Scott, would you like for us to document a minority opinion on this?
Well, I would just point out that it isn't that we're not supporting continued consultation. We're just, at least for myself, I'm feeling like Walter said that there will be continuing consultation. I just don't think there needs to be a separate process. I'm supportive of the continuing communication with agencies and proposers.
Okay.
I would agree with what Scott said, and then also what I put on the record for the first vote regarding where this third bucket came from.
Yep. Okay. I believe we have one more slide that we want to touch on briefly, and then we will let you all go. Or do we have a public comment and tribal comment opportunity still that we need to make sure that.
All right, are we going to the next slide, or are we?
Yeah, go to the next slide real briefly.
Okay. So real briefly, I just wanted to put it out there for everyone that we have an opportunity to make other recommendations to OPAC. We had touched on these at the end of our meeting in February, but I don't think we got an opportunity to complete that discussion. But wanted to call it to everyone's attention here. Oops, sorry, this is, I think my slides got jumbled around in there. There we go. We have the opportunity to make coast-wide recommendations as well as general site-based recommendations. So for coast-wide recommendations, some of our thoughts are develop statewide monitoring interpretive program, identify needs, support infrastructure, establish a rocky habitat management program within the state, coordinate with and leverage existing programs such as volunteer groups and other groups that do education and site interpretation, develop metrics for things like wildlife disturbance and monitoring, funding partnerships. So these are the kinds of things that we could include in a broad-based coast-wide recommendation to the council. We could also include some more site-specific recommendations or recommendations on how to manage sites, rocky habitat sites. So it's very similar things: coordinate volunteer programs, implement site-based monitoring that leverages existing programs, develop site-focused management plans, other management rules and recommendations and restrictions, additional wildlife disturbance and monitoring metrics, and monitoring timelines using those site-based metrics. So these are some of the kind of broad-based problem-solving ideas that we have identified, all of us, throughout this process. So we wanted to give everyone an opportunity to kind of think about what those recommendations might be to the council.
Yeah, and this is something that I would like to do following our site-based recommendations, either on Thursday or on Friday morning. So this is more of a heads up to everyone that we want to have this discussion, and intend to think about whether or not there's consensus on making a recommendation like this that would come out of our process. Okay, Moses, end of the day here. Let's provide the opportunity. I don't believe we have any, we might have a tribal member actually. So let's see if there's anyone who has a public comment and or a tribal comment, tribal nations comment. Please raise your hand if you'd like to speak, or put something in the chat and I will allow you to do so. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody for tribal nations comment. We did have public comment earlier, but I want to allow one more go at this if folks would like to have any last thoughts communicated to the group. Kent.
Hi, this is Kent Doty with Lincoln City Audubon. I'll keep it brief. For us, our proposals are about building community. And it's a very different conversation to say have a Zoom meeting or a town meeting, say we have a proposal, it's not recommended. What do you think? Versus we have a continuing discussion, and these are the problems we need to solve. Will you help me solve it? We're looking at how to build alliances with those that may not agree with us now, or keep and grow supporters that we have. So I think a continuation builds that community, because we're thinking not only of the continuing consultation with the agencies, with all of our stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Kent. Is there anyone else who would like to provide comment? Okay, Moses, any last thoughts to close us out, or Charlie?
I want to thank everybody. I know that we have had for 3 years now, many of these circular type discussions. They're very difficult, and they're never right. They're somewhere in between. And so we do the best we can, and I really appreciate everybody's work. I really appreciate all the people who've been listening in and following along, all the proposers and the OPAC members and otherwise. It's just a lot to listen to, I'm sure. So I appreciate your engagement as well. That'll be really important, informing us our work on Thursday. The last thing I want to mention, maybe more of your benefit, is I am getting my second Moderna shot on Wednesday of this week, which means Thursday I could be in pretty rough shape. The good news is I probably won't be very talkative. So you won't have to listen to me very much, but there will be a facilitator. Frank will be here to help us, Frank Burris, who helped us with that first meeting. I'm glad that we were able to do this today and get a little more buy-in around understanding how we're going to do our voting and how we're going to move through these different sites. And so I will leave it at that. And I look forward to hopefully feeling okay for our discussion on Thursday.
Best of luck, Charlie.
Get ready.
Yep. All right. Well, I think with that, meeting adjourned. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you Thursday.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Great job on updating the slides there, Moses. That was impressive to do it on the fly.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. And Tom, I noted your message in the chat. So
Thanks. I'll bring it up again, later, but figure give you guys a heads up.
All right. Take care, folks.
Thanks.